The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when Jake, Sam, and Emily finally found a clearing large enough to set up their campsite. They had been hiking for hours, following a barely marked trail in the dense woods of northern Michigan. The air was crisp, carrying the musky scent of pine needles and damp earth. Jake hammered the tent stakes into the ground while Sam gathered firewood, and Emily unpacked the supplies from their backpacks. The first signs of night crept over the treetops, turning the forest into a shadowy labyrinth. By the time the tent was pitched and the fire crackling, the temperature had dropped noticeably. They sat around the flames, roasting marshmallows and joking about the haunted stories Jake had read online. The stories were mostly about campers who claimed to hear footsteps outside their tents or see glowing eyes in the darkness. Emily shivered, partly from the cold and partly from the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. She shook it off, attributing it to being alone in the woods at night. After eating, they decided to turn in early. The fire burned low, and the crackling of logs was the only sound besides the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Jake and Sam snored lightly, but Emily couldn't sleep. The wind whispered through the trees, sounding eerily like hushed voices. She thought she heard footsteps crunching on leaves, but when she listened closer, they stopped. Maybe it was her imagination, she told herself. Around midnight, Emily woke to a strange smell, something metallic, like blood, mixed with damp earth. She sat up, her headlamp on, scanning the dark edges of the campsite. At first, she saw nothing, but then movement caught her eye. A shadow, tall and thin, lurked just beyond the firelight. Her heart pounded in her chest. She shook Jake awake, whispering frantically. He groaned but got up when he saw the fear in her eyes. "Probably a deer," Jake muttered, trying to reassure her. Sam, now awake, nodded, though his eyes betrayed worry. They shined their flashlights around, but the shadow was gone. Only the trees swayed in the cold wind. They decided to double-check the perimeter, each taking a flashlight. The beam of light revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the dense forest, twisting and unending. They laughed nervously, blaming the shadows and sounds on the imagination and exhaustion. Back in the tent, Emily still couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening. Then she heard it again, the crunching of leaves, but this time, closer. She held her breath, straining her ears. The sound circled the tent, slow and deliberate, stopping occasionally. Jake and Sam were asleep, oblivious. She debated waking them again, but before she could, the tent flap rustled violently. Jake shot awake, flashlight in hand. "Who's there?" he shouted. Silence followed. Only the crackle of the dying fire remained. He unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside, Emily and Sam behind him. The campsite looked empty. But then they noticed the footprints. Human, but unnervingly large, leading into the woods and circling back around the clearing as if whoever had walked there had been watching them the entire time. Emily felt a surge of panic. "We need to leave," she whispered. Jake hesitated, scanning the darkness. "It's probably some other campers messing with us," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sam frowned. "In the middle of the night, out here, with nobody for miles?" His doubt was clear. They packed hurriedly, but as they slung backpacks over their shoulders, a sound stopped them cold, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows beyond the firelight. It was closer than the trees, just beyond the clearing. The hairs on their necks stood on end. Then they saw it. Two glowing eyes, impossibly bright, staring at them from the dark. The figure moved quickly between the trees, tall and humanoid, but unnaturally thin and long-limbed. Jake grabbed a log from the fire, holding it defensively. "Run!" he yelled. They sprinted along the trail they had hiked earlier, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, a heavy, dragging footstep that didn't sound entirely human. Emily stumbled but got back up, fear fueling her legs. They ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. The forest seemed endless, twisting into darkness, every tree a potential threat. They turned down a small incline, hoping to find a road or a ranger station, but the trail vanished into thick undergrowth. Panic set in fully as the growling got louder, closer. It wasn't running. They could hear the creature moving in unnerving, fluid motions, like it was gliding over the forest floor. Suddenly, Sam tripped and fell. Emily grabbed his arm, yanking him up, but a shriek tore through the air, a high, piercing sound that wasn't human. They turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the small clearing they had entered. Its body was impossibly thin, with long fingers and a head that tilted unnaturally, observing them. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and it made a series of clicks and growls that sounded almost intelligent. Jake yelled and swung the log at it, but the creature didn't even flinch. It advanced slowly, methodically. Emily grabbed a large branch and swung wildly, connecting with its shoulder. It let out a screech that rattled their ears and darted behind a tree, disappearing from view. They didn't wait. They ran again, deeper into the forest, hearts hammering, lungs burning. Hours passed. They stumbled over roots, fell into mud, and tripped on hidden rocks. The forest seemed endless, the darkness oppressive. Occasionally, they would stop to listen, but the creature was always just behind them, sometimes visible, sometimes just a fleeting shadow. Their flashlights flickered, batteries dying, leaving them with only moonlight and the stars filtering through the trees. At dawn, exhausted and terrified, they reached a small stream. Jake knelt to drink, hoping to get some energy back. Emily scanned the woods. The creature was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over them, though uneasily. They decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead to a road or a campsite. By late morning, the sound of a vehicle reached their ears. They ran toward it and finally stumbled onto a gravel road. A truck was coming toward them, and they flagged it down frantically. The driver, a local ranger, took one look at their mud-streaked, disheveled faces and stopped immediately. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. Emily and Jake tried to explain, but it sounded insane even as they spoke. "Some kind of creature in the woods," Emily said. The ranger frowned, exchanging a glance with another officer who had arrived. "You're lucky to be alive," the ranger said quietly. "We've had reports, people disappearing around here. Tracks that don't make sense, growls, shadows. You three were probably being followed the entire night. Nothing we've got a name for. People just call it the Watcher." The words sent shivers down their spines. Even as they drove away, leaving the woods behind, Emily could feel the weight of unseen eyes. Something was still watching, waiting for the next campers who wandered too far from the trail. They never went camping in that area again. And even years later, when Emily, Jake, and Sam told their story, locals would nod quietly, refusing to say much. Some things, they said, were better left alone in the dark. Story the end. It was late August when a group of 5 friends from Ohio decided to take a long weekend camping trip deep in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. The idea was simple: escape the heat of the city, disconnect from phones, and immerse themselves in nature. They were all in their early 20s, confident and careless in equal measure. Ben, the unofficial leader of the group, had picked the campsite, a remote clearing miles off the main trail, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to block out the sky. The first day passed without incident. They hiked a few miles, gathered firewood, and set up their tents near a shallow creek. As the sun fell behind the thick pines, the air cooled rapidly. They built a campfire, grilled hot dogs and marshmallows, and laughed at stories from past trips. The woods were alive with the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a long, drawn-out hoo that echoed eerily. Night fell fully, and they settled into their tents. Around 11 p.m., Ben suggested they take a short walk to explore the nearby ridge. Flashlights in hand, they moved through the darkness, their beams bouncing off twisted roots and damp foliage. That's when the first odd sound hit them. A snapping of branches, distinct and deliberate, just a few dozen feet away. At first, they laughed it off, assuming a deer or raccoon, but then they noticed it wasn't just random. The snapping followed them as they walked. Every few steps, a crack from the underbrush. A shadow flickered at the edge of their light. Heartbeats quickened, and Ben called it a night, dragging everyone back to camp. The tension didn't end there. Around 2 a.m., Anna woke up to something brushing against her tent. Her heart pounding, she sat up, shining her flashlight out the tent flap. The beam caught nothing, only the thick blackness of the woods. She nudged Mark, who groaned but woke enough to see what she was looking at. The next few minutes were silence except for the rustling. Then a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Mark tried to rationalize it as a bear, but the sound was wrong. Too close, too intelligent, almost watching them. They huddled together in the tent until the morning light broke the tension. The next day, the friends decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to shake off the nerves from the night. They found an abandoned hunting cabin tucked away between two hills. Its wooden walls were rotting, the roof caved in, and the windows shattered. Despite the condition, curiosity drew them inside. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay, and old, yellowed newspapers littered the floor. One headline caught Ben's eye: "Local hiker missing in Monongahela Forest." He laughed nervously, showing it to the others. "Just your usual clickbait," he said, but his voice betrayed doubt. As they exited the cabin, the sun started to drop. A thick fog rolled in quickly, unusual for that time of year. Visibility dropped to just a few feet, and they realized the trail back to their campsite wasn't as clear as they remembered. Anxiety mounted. Then they noticed the footprints: large, humanoid, but not quite human. Broad, uneven, with toes too long and nails too sharp. They weren't alone. Panic set in. They tried to retrace their steps, but the forest seemed to twist, paths overlapping in impossible ways. Every clearing looked the same. Their phones had no signal. Then came the sounds, footsteps behind them, but when they turned, no one was there. A whispering voice carried on the wind, low and chilling, like someone breathing directly into their ears, saying words they couldn't understand but felt distinctly threatening. By evening, they stumbled onto a small, dried-up stream and decided to follow it, thinking water would lead them back to familiar terrain. Darkness fell faster than expected, and the fog thickened into a wall of white. The whispers turned into scratches. Tree trunks clawed with an unnatural force, branches bending as though something heavy was pushing through. They ran. Suddenly, Anna screamed. Something darted between the trees. Mark caught a glimpse of it, a tall figure, hunched, moving impossibly fast. Its eyes glowed faintly red in the reflection of their flashlights. It wasn't human. It didn't run. It glided. They bolted blindly, tripping over roots and rocks. Ben led the way, shouting for everyone to keep together. But when they stumbled into a small clearing, Anna was gone, just vanished. No sound, no struggle. The others screamed her name, calling for her in the fog, but only the echo of their own voices returned. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, time lost meaning in the thick forest. They finally found their campsite, only to discover the tents slashed open. Their supplies were gone, the fire pit cold, and the creek dried up. There were marks around the perimeter, huge, clawed indentations in the dirt, smeared with what looked like dark, congealed blood. Fear consumed them, and they agreed to leave immediately. They grabbed what little gear they had left and started hiking, hoping to find the main trail. But the forest had changed. Landmarks they had memorized were gone, replaced by endless trees and mist. The whispers returned, closer now, circling them. Ben tried to shout commands, but the group was fractured, screaming in panic. Mark tripped, and when he looked up, he saw another figure, taller, darker, with elongated limbs reaching toward him. He ran, leaving Ben behind. By morning, only Mark and Ben were left. Exhausted, terrified, they found an old dirt road and stumbled onto a logging path that led them out of the forest. When they reached the nearest town, the authorities were skeptical. They had no proof of what happened. Anna and the others were never found. Rangers found the campsite weeks later. The slashed tents and claw marks were still there, but no footprints led away, just the eerie silence of a forest that had swallowed them whole. Mark never returned to the woods. Ben tried to once, to face whatever it was, but he couldn't. At night, Mark sometimes hears whispering outside his window, soft and deliberate, as if reminding him that the forest never forgets and it never releases its prey. Even years later, when news reports mention missing hikers in West Virginia, Mark can't stop thinking about that night. He knows, deep down, that whatever lurks in the Monongahela National Forest is patient, intelligent, and watching to surprise, waiting for the next group foolish enough to wander too far off the trail. The friends' trip, meant to be a simple escape into nature, became a cautionary tale whispered among locals. They say the forest has eyes, and those eyes hunger. Travelers who enter alone or even in groups sometimes vanish without a trace. And when the fog rolls in and the wind carries those low, guttural whispers, it's a warning. The woods are not forgiving, and some things in the shadows are not human at all. Story, the end. The sun was starting to dip behind the tall pines when Jake and his friends finally found the clearing. They'd been hiking since early morning, lugging backpacks that were far heavier than they anticipated, but the sense of freedom kept them moving. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and a distant stream gurgled like a gentle promise. They set up their tents quickly, knowing the forest would darken fast and the temperature would drop even faster. Jake was the first to light the fire, his lighter sparking a small flame that he nurtured into a steady blaze. The others, Mark, Sarah, and Emily, gathered around, roasting hot dogs and laughing at stories from college. Everything felt normal, peaceful, almost too peaceful, but Jake had learned to trust his gut. Something about the forest tonight felt off. The shadows between the trees seemed longer than they should have been, and the wind carried a strange, faint rustling that didn't match the leaves. "Relax, man," Mark said, noticing Jake's tense expression. "You've been reading too many horror stories." "Maybe," Jake admitted, poking at the fire with a stick. "Just keep your eyes open." They laughed it off, and night settled over the woods like a heavy blanket. The fire's glow barely reached past the clearing, and the sounds of crickets and distant owls filled the darkness. Hours passed as they sat in a comfortable silence, staring at the flames, until Emily yawned and suggested they all head to their tents. Jake zipped up his tent and lay on his sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easy. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned and creaked like something alive. Then he heard it, a soft, dragging sound in the underbrush. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakably deliberate, like someone or something was moving with purpose toward the clearing. He sat up, heart racing. "Guys," he whispered through the thin fabric of his tent. No answer. He unzipped the tent and peeked out. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. The woods were still, almost too still. He thought he saw movement, just at the edge of the firelight. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Jake?" Mark's voice came from the other tent. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Jake replied, forcing calm. "I must have imagined it." But the gnawing feeling in his stomach didn't disappear. Around midnight, a scream cut through the night, high-pitched, terrified, and raw. It came from the woods, not from their camp, and it froze them all. "Emily?" Sarah called, jumping to her feet. They grabbed flashlights, and Jake grabbed his hunting knife from the backpack. The beam of his light sliced through the darkness, but all they saw were shadows and trees swaying in the wind. "Maybe it's an animal," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A coyote or something." "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "That sounded human." They stayed huddled near the dying fire, listening. The rustling returned, louder now, circling them. The smell came next, a metallic tang that made Jake's stomach churn. He realized it was blood. "Guys," he said, voice low, "we need to get out. Now." "Out? At night?" Emily whispered, panic in her eyes. "Through the woods?" "Through the woods is exactly where it is," Jake said. He couldn't explain it, but something deep in him knew they couldn't stay. They grabbed what they could, flashlights, knives, some water, and moved quietly into the trees. The dragging sound followed, now unmistakable. Branches snapped under weight heavier than theirs, and a low growl, something primal, echoed between the trunks. Suddenly, a figure appeared, tall, hunched, completely black against the shadows, its eyes glowing faint red in the flashlight beams. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The thing didn't run, didn't move quickly, just stared. Its presence alone made the hairs on his neck stand. "Run!" Jay sprinted, branches tearing at their clothes, their hearts hammering. The forest seemed endless, every turn leading them deeper into a nightmare. They stumbled into a small clearing, and the thing followed, silent but relentless. Sarah tripped over a root and went down hard. Jake reached back, helping her to her feet, but the sound of her scream as the figure loomed over them made him lose control of reason. The figure didn't attack immediately. It moved with a deliberate calm, circling them like predators do with prey. It seemed to be studying them, as if deciding which one to pick first. Emily sobbed, gripping Jake's arm. What is it?" "I don't know," he gasped, "but it's not human." The red glow in its eyes grew brighter, and the dragging sound returned, now accompanied by guttural hisses. Something hit the ground near them. A body? They couldn't tell in the dark, but a familiar scream cut through the night, and Mark was gone. Panic consumed them. They ran blindly, diving into thick underbrush, climbing over fallen logs. Jake's legs burned, his lungs ached, but adrenaline kept him moving. He could hear the thing behind them, close now, its breathing wet and heavy. Then silence. They slowed, afraid to move, listening. The forest seemed almost peaceful again, but Jake knew better. He could feel it watching, waiting. A whisper of wind carried a faint sound, a dragging, a low groan, and then something almost human, a whisper. Help, me. Jake's stomach twisted. He recognized the voice. It was Mark. But when they ran toward it, it wasn't him. It was the figure, mimicking the voice, holding something bloody and mangled. No! Emily screamed, backing away. The figure tilted its head, red eyes glowing, and then vanished into the darkness, leaving only the scent of blood and the echo of Mark's scream behind. The three of them ran until dawn, eventually finding a dirt road. They flagged down a passing car, collapsing in the headlights, shaking and covered in scratches and mud. The driver didn't believe them. Probably just a bear or something, he said, shaking his head. But Jake knew the truth. The authorities searched the area, but they found no trace of Mark. No signs of struggle, nothing. Just the forest, silent and undisturbed in the daylight, as if nothing had happened. Jake, Emily, and Sarah never went camping again. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, Jake swears he can hear the dragging sound circling the edges of the woods near his home, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, he hears a faint whisper of a voice calling his name from the shadows, promising it's still out there, still watching, still hungry. Story the end. The sun was beginning to set as we drove the last few miles down the winding forest road. The trees were thick, their shadows stretching across the asphalt like dark fingers. My friends and I, Jake, Melissa, Ryan, and I, were buzzing with excitement. This was supposed to be the weekend that kicked off summer right. 3 days camping, deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania, away from cell service, Wi-Fi, and everything we knew. We had backpacks loaded with food, tents, and sleeping bags, and the cooler rattled in the back of Jake's truck. The campsite was almost exactly what we had pictured from the photos online. A clearing just big enough for our tents, surrounded on all sides by towering pines. A narrow stream cut across the back of the clearing, and there was a small crumbling fire pit from some long-forgotten campers. As we unloaded, the sky shifted from gold to deep orange, and the forest seemed to lean closer, like it was watching us. I remember thinking it was beautiful, but also just a little too quiet. Not just the absence of people, but no birds, no squirrels, nothing. The kind of silence that feels alive. We set up our tents quickly, laughing at how amateurish some of us were at pitching them. I ended up with Ryan in the same tent, and our plan was simple: a fire, a couple of beers, maybe tell some ghost stories before falling asleep to the sounds of the forest. Once the fire was going, we sat around it, the flames cracking and spitting sparks into the night. The first few hours passed easily. We joked about haunted woods and urban legends, daring each other to go further down the stream or into the thicker parts of the forest. Around 11 p.m., Jake suggested we take a walk. He'd been peering into the trees earlier, saying he thought he saw movement, but everyone laughed it off. Still, we grabbed flashlights and went. The woods seemed different at night. The shadows were longer, the noises sharper, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. But we told ourselves it was probably deer or some other animal. Then we heard it. A low, guttural hum. Not a growl, not a howl, something in between. It didn't seem animal. It came from deeper in the trees, moving slowly, almost like it was following us. Melissa froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all nodded, trying to appear calm, but my stomach dropped. The sound grew louder as we shined our flashlights into the dark. There was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just the hum. Then it stopped. Ryan laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind, guys. Seriously." But even he didn't sound convinced. We hurried back to camp, each of us pretending we weren't scared. When we reached the clearing, the fire had dimmed to a weak glow. Jake tried to act casual, tossing a log onto the embers. "Maybe we should just go to sleep," he said. We agreed, though sleep was uneasy. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound I can't forget, something dragging itself through the leaves outside our tent. I froze. Ryan stirred next to me. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, wide-eyed. The dragging got closer, circling our tent. The canvas seemed to ripple with each movement. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The morning was tense. None of us wanted to talk about it at first, pretending like nothing had happened. The sun felt like a relief. We decided to hike a trail marked on the old map we had brought, something to distract ourselves. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and it led to a small pond. Beautiful, quiet, serene, but also eerie. As we walked, Melissa kept glancing behind us, convinced someone, or something, was following. I tried to laugh it off, but even I kept looking over my shoulder. It was Ryan who noticed the footprints first. They were large, wider than any human foot, but not quite animal. The prints were fresh, pressed into the damp soil along the trail. No claws, no fur, just large, heavy footprints. And they led straight into the trees, away from the pond. We debated whether to follow them, the tension growing by the second. Jake, stubborn as ever, wanted to see where they went. Melissa begged us not to. I think I was halfway scared enough to agree with her, but the others pushed on. The deeper we went, the forest seemed to close in. The shadows grew thick. The hum from last night returned, low and constant, echoing through the trunks. Then we saw it. At first, just a shape crouched between two pines. Then it moved, fast. It was humanoid, but twisted. Too tall, too thin, skin pale with dark smudges, eyes reflecting the flashlight beams like molten metal. We froze. It let out a sound, not a growl, not a scream, but a high-pitched screech that rattled our bones. We ran. The forest blurred around us, roots and branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The thing followed, never fast enough to catch us, but always close enough that we could hear it, smell it, feel its presence. Melissa tripped, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her up. Ryan disappeared for a second, screaming, but reappeared, blood running from a scratch across his arm. We finally burst back into the clearing. The creature stopped at the tree line, just beyond the firelight, watching us. Then it vanished. We didn't speak much after that. We packed up in silence, the beauty of the forest completely gone. Driving back to the main road, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see it standing there, staring. When we reached the highway, we finally breathed. Cell service returned, and for some reason, that felt like salvation. We tried to tell ourselves it was a hallucination, stress, adrenaline, but the scratches on Ryan's arm, the footprints Melissa had photographed with her phone, and the hum that none of us could explain told a different story. Years later, I've returned to other campsites in Pennsylvania, but I never go near that section of woods again. None of us do. And sometimes when I'm alone, I can still hear that hum in the back of my mind, the slow, creeping echo of something that waits just beyond the tree line. Story the end. The sun was already dipping behind the pines when Matt, Sarah, and Luke finally found a clearing that felt right. They had been driving the back roads of northern Pennsylvania for hours, searching for a quiet spot to camp away from the crowds. Their plan had been simple: hike, fish, roast marshmallows, tell ghost stories, and fall asleep under the stars. They had all grown up in suburban towns, far removed from anything resembling wilderness, but this weekend was meant to feel raw, real, and adventurous. Matt, the unofficial leader of the group, pulled the car to a stop at the edge of the clearing. He stepped out, taking in the air that smelled of damp earth and pine resin. The forest around them was dense and silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ache at first because you realized how loud life always was in the city. Sarah and Luke climbed out, stretching their legs, and the three of them looked around for a spot to pitch their tents. "This one," Matt said, pointing to a flat patch near a small stream. "Close to water, but not too close. We'll be fine here." Luke shrugged, but didn't argue. He had always trusted Matt to pick the right spots. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't entirely convinced. She had a feeling that there was something about this place, something slightly off. But she brushed it aside. She didn't want to be the buzzkill on the first night. They spent the next hour setting up the tents and collecting firewood. The light was fading fast, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing like long, dark fingers. By the time the fire was crackling, the forest had already swallowed the sun, and the air had cooled to that sharp autumn bite. Luke threw a couple of logs onto the fire. "This is perfect," he said, throwing himself down on a log. "No cell service, no people, just us and the woods." Sarah nodded, but her unease didn't dissipate. She felt watched, though she told herself it was just her imagination. She tried to laugh it off when Matt started pulling a pack of marshmallows and a small bottle of whiskey from his backpack. As darkness settled, Matt began to tell a story, the kind they had all heard before, about campers who got lost and vanished in the woods. Sarah listened, half amused, half on edge, while Luke kept tossing logs onto the fire. The shadows danced wildly across their faces, and for the first time, Sarah realized the forest wasn't just silent, it was expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Then they heard it, a faint snap. Something breaking a twig. At first, they thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the sound came again, closer this time. All three froze. Probably a raccoon, Matt said, though his voice lacked conviction. The snapping continued intermittently, circling their camp. Sarah's heart started racing. "Guys, do you hear that?" she whispered. Luke tried to peer into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice had gone quieter, more cautious. Matt grabbed a flashlight and swung it toward the tree line, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. The snapping had stopped. For a moment, relief washed over them. Then another sound. Low, deliberate, like something dragging across the underbrush. "Maybe we should just get inside the tents," Sarah suggested. They reluctantly agreed. Inside her tent, Sarah could still hear it, the rustling, soft steps that moved with intent, circling their small clearing. She couldn't sleep. Luke and Matt were snoring lightly in the adjacent tents, but she lay awake, straining to hear every sound. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of shadows and noises. Then she heard a voice. Not a human voice, not a whisper of wind, but something closer to a low, guttural murmur, spoken in a language she didn't recognize. The sound came from right outside her tent, then from the stream, then back to the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat. Sarah didn't want to wake the others. She told herself it was an animal, or maybe she was dreaming. But when she unzipped the tent slightly and shone her flashlight out, she saw something. Two glowing eyes reflected back at her. They were low to the ground, far too wide apart to be a deer. They blinked slowly, deliberately, unafraid. And then they moved, sliding into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. She zipped the tent back up and tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were being watched more closely than any normal animal could watch. The next morning, the forest seemed innocuous, even peaceful. Birds called to each other. The sun streamed through the canopy. Matt laughed, brushing off Sarah's warnings from the night before. "You're just imagining things," he said. "It's the woods, weird noises, shadows, completely normal." But then, while they were eating breakfast, they found tracks in the soft earth around their campsite. Not human, not deer. They were long, wide, clawed, and they circled the clearing in no discernible pattern, as though something had been pacing. Sarah pointed at them. "These weren't here last night." Matt knelt, examining the prints. "Huh, weird. Probably just some big dog or coyote." But even as he said it, none of them believed it. They decided to hike, thinking that maybe being on a trail would make the forest less threatening. The trail was narrow, winding, and overgrown, but it felt safe, or at least safer than being near their tents. Hours later, when they reached a small abandoned cabin marked on an old trail map Matt had brought, they thought it would be a good place to rest. The cabin was rickety, windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges, but it offered shelter from the growing wind and a chance to escape the oppressive forest canopy. Inside, dust covered every surface. There was a faint smell of decay, and on the wall, scratched deeply into the wood, were symbols they didn't recognize. Geometric shapes, circles and lines forming patterns that felt deliberately threatening. Sarah felt a chill. "We shouldn't be here," she said. Luke shrugged. "It's just old graffiti, probably some kids messing around." Matt, however, seemed unnerved. He kept glancing outside, the corners of his mouth tight. "We need to head back before dark," he said. "I don't like it here." They turned to leave, and that's when they heard the sound, a low, guttural growl, almost human, coming from the tree line. The hair on Sarah's arms stood on end. The growl was followed by snapping, fast and chaotic, moving closer. They broke into a run, back toward the clearing where their tents had been. But when they got there, the clearing was empty. Their tents were gone, ripped to shreds, scattered across the ground. Footprints, much larger than any humans, led away into the trees. Panic set in. Matt grabbed a flashlight and tried to follow, but the forest seemed to twist, paths looping back on themselves. It was as if the woods themselves had changed overnight. Every tree looked the same. Every sound was amplified. The growling followed them, echoing through the pines. Something large moved through the underbrush, faster than any human could run. Sarah tripped, scraping her knee. Luke reached back for her, but in that instant she saw movement in the shadows. Figures, tall and thin, moving in ways that defied human anatomy, eyes glowing like coals. They ran blindly until finally they stumbled onto a dirt road. Cars weren't passing, and there were no signs of other people, just a faint trail of tire marks and old signposts. But it was enough. They ran until they could see the faint glow of headlights in the distance. When they reached a small gas station, hours later, exhausted and shaking, they tried to explain what had happened. The attendant listened, nodding, but didn't seem surprised. "Those woods, people go missing out there," he said quietly. "Not often, but sometimes. The locals don't talk about it. Just stay out. That's all I can say." Matt, Sarah, and Luke didn't return to the forest after that. But in the years since, every time Sarah drives past that area, she feels the same chill in her chest, the same weight in the air, like something unseen is always watching, waiting. She can still hear the snapping of twigs, the low growl, the whisper of eyes in the darkness. And she knows, deep down, that the forest has not forgotten them. Story the end. The sun was dipping below the horizon as we pulled off the narrow dirt road, our old Jeep rattling over tree roots and loose rocks. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a chance to escape the noise of the city, but something about the dense woods around Camp Hollow Creek made my stomach tighten. My friends, Kyle, Jesse, and Marcus, seemed oblivious to it, chattering excitedly about setting up tents and building a fire. The site we found was just off the main trail, a small clearing with a stream trickling nearby. Perfectly quiet, maybe too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. We set up camp as the last light faded, Marcus and Kyle wrestling the tent poles while Jesse and I gathered firewood. When darkness fully settled, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees, and every crack of a branch made us jump. We finally had a small fire going, the flames casting an orange glow on our faces. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, laughing nervously at the stories we told to scare each other. But the laughter felt forced. It started subtly. First, it was the sound of footsteps, crunching, slow, measured, coming from just beyond the tree line. "Probably deer," Kyle said, though he didn't sound convinced. We all froze, listening. The steps stopped whenever we looked back, but resumed once we returned to our own activities. By the time we went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Our tents were close together, but I still felt isolated in mine. Every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering, faint, almost melodic, like a voice calling my name. I unzipped my tent a little and peered into the darkness. Nothing. Just the shadows of the trees and the firelight from the other tents. The next morning, Kyle mentioned seeing strange markings on a tree near the stream. Deep scratches, jagged, almost like claw marks, but too deliberate, too patterned to be random. We joked about wild animals again, but there was an edge to our voices. We decided to explore the area, following a small trail that wound deeper into the woods. After about 20 minutes, we came across an abandoned campsite. Old, rotting tents leaned to one side, charred remnants of a fire still visible in the ashes. Jesse felt uneasy and suggested turning back, but Marcus, ever curious, wanted to investigate further. We found something etched into a tree trunk, symbols, circular patterns with lines radiating outward. None of us recognized them. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever had been here before wasn't just camping, they were leaving messages, or warnings. On our way back, the footsteps started again, closer this time. I could hear breathing, uneven and shallow. I turned sharply, but again the shadows offered no one. That night, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. This time, it was a full sentence. "Don't stay here." My tent shook slightly, like something was brushing against the outside. I bolted awake, screaming for the others. By the time they came running, the sound had vanished. We spent the next day trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was pranksters, maybe wildlife, maybe our minds playing tricks. But none of us could shake the feeling of being hunted. That night, as we sat around the fire, the forest erupted with sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, low growls echoing from all directions. Shadows moved at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the clearing. One of the shadows was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to glide rather than walk. Marcus, trying to prove he wasn't scared, grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam hit nothing, but the whispering returned, urgent, angry. Something was circling us, just beyond visibility. Jessie started crying. Kyle tried to calm her, but I noticed his hands shaking. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the forest behind our tents. Something had torn through the underbrush, heading directly toward us. We scrambled, grabbing whatever we could for defense. But the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I heard it, the breathing, deep and ragged, right outside my tent. I shined my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse. A tall, emaciated figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, features distorted and human-like, yet grotesquely wrong. We ran, through the forest, blindly, tripping over roots and rocks. Every step felt like we were being funneled into something, like the forest itself was closing in. Behind us, branches snapped, the low growls chasing us. Somehow, we made it back to the Jeep. Kyle was pale, shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt path, not looking back. When we finally reached the main road, sunlight was breaking over the horizon. We stopped at a gas station, all of us silent, staring at the empty forest behind us. The panic hadn't left, though. Every sound outside the Jeep made us jump. We tried calling the ranger station, but no one answered. And when we finally reached cell service, every number we called went straight to voicemail. Later that week, I tried to make sense of what happened. I looked up Camp Hollow Creek and found old newspaper articles, several disappearances over the last 30 years, hikers and campers gone without a trace. Some reports mentioned claw marks, strange symbols carved into trees, eerie whispers in the night. One old article even described a figure matching what we saw. Tall, thin, humanoid, hunting those who ventured too deep. They called it the Watcher. I haven't gone camping since. The woods feel different now, even when I see them in pictures or on TV. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear whispering outside my window. Not far away, not subtle, insistent, like it's searching. Kyle, Jessie, and Marcus didn't want to talk about it either, but sometimes I get texts from them, strange short messages like, "I hear it again," or just a single word, "watch." We never meet up anymore, and when we do, the conversation drifts quickly to mundane topics. But we all know the truth. Something is out there, waiting, marking trees, whispering in the dark, hunting anyone foolish enough to camp in the wrong place. People laugh when I warn them about the woods. "It's just a story," they say, smiling. I don't correct them, because if I did, maybe they'd hear it too. The whispers in the trees, calling your name, and maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't make it out. I've thought about going back to prove it wasn't real, but I can't. Even writing this, I feel its eyes on me. And I know it's only a matter of time before someone else disappears in those woods. Someone else hears the whispers and someone else meets the Watcher. Some nights I dream of the forest. Not the trees, not the sky, not the stars, just the figure gliding silently, watching, waiting. And when I wake, sometimes there are scratches on my window frame. Small, jagged, familiar. Story the end. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as Jake, Emily, and their two friends, Tyler and Melissa, drove deeper into the Appalachian forest. They had been planning this camping trip for months, a weekend escape from their cramped city lives, complete with hiking, fishing, and the promise of nights under the stars. The sun was just starting its descent when they found a clearing by a narrow stream, perfect for setting up camp. The surrounding trees were tall and dense, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. The only sounds were the gentle gurgle of the water and the occasional bird call. Jake was the first to hop out of the truck, grabbing the sleeping bags and tent poles. "This spot's perfect," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Emily smiled, taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air. "Yeah, it's beautiful. Just what we needed." They worked together, pitching the tent near the stream while Tyler started gathering firewood. Melissa wandered a bit along the edge of the clearing, snapping photos of the thick forest and the light filtering through the leaves. The sun had dipped below the horizon when they finally sat around the fire. its flames crackling and illuminating their faces. The first night passed without incident. The only interruptions were the sounds of distant owls and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. By morning, the group had gone on a short hike, enjoying the crisp air and panoramic views from a ridge overlooking the valley below. It was Tyler who first suggested they explore a little deeper into the woods, beyond the marked trail. "There's a creek on the map a few miles north. Shouldn't be too far," he said with a grin. At first, the hike was exhilarating. They laughed and joked as they wove between trees, stepping over roots and climbing over fallen logs. But as the hours passed, the forest grew denser, darker. The path became harder to follow, marked only by faint tracks and broken branches. A feeling of unease began to settle over the group, though none admitted it aloud. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing. It was eerily quiet. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, were absent. Emily knelt by a patch of wildflowers near the edge of the clearing. "It's beautiful, but it feels wrong here," she said softly. Jake laughed, brushing off the comment. "You always get spooked by quiet spots. Come on, let's keep moving." They had only gone a few hundred yards when they noticed something strange. A series of carvings on the trees, jagged and uneven, almost like crude symbols. Tyler frowned. "This doesn't look natural. Who would carve these out here?" Before anyone could answer, they heard a sound, soft at first, like twigs snapping, then a faint, dragging shuffle. It came from deeper in the forest, just beyond the clearing. The group froze. Jake motioned for everyone to stay calm. Probably just a deer or some other animal. Let's not freak ourselves out. Still, the sound persisted, growing slightly louder and more deliberate. Melissa grabbed Jake's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Let's head back to camp." As they turned, they realized they were no longer sure which direction they had come from. Every tree looked the same, the shadows stretching in odd angles as the sun slipped behind thick clouds. Panic began to creep in. Tyler pulled out his phone. No signal. He tried again. Nothing. "Great," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We'll just follow the creek back. We can't be far from the trail." But as they approached the sound of water, they found only more trees. The creek they had been following seemed to have vanished. The forest was a maze, every turn leading them deeper into the unknown. The dragging sound was still there, always just out of sight, always just behind them. By evening, the group was exhausted, their nerves fraying. They decided to set up a temporary camp for the night, using fallen branches to form a small fire pit. The fire barely kept the darkness at bay. Shadows danced along the trees, stretching in unnatural ways. Around midnight, Emily woke to a low, guttural growl. She shook Jake awake. "Something's out there." Jake listened. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but the sound was wrong, too deliberate, too intelligent. It circled their makeshift camp, pausing occasionally as if listening. The fire flickered, sending brief glimpses of a figure at the tree line, a tall, thin silhouette, unnervingly still. "Stay calm," Jake whispered, though his voice trembled. He fumbled for a stick, trying to look brave. The growl continued, closer now, accompanied by soft, dragging footsteps. Tyler whispered, We shouldn't have come this far in. We need to move. Now." They grabbed what little they could carry, flashlights, a small backpack each, and fled into the forest. The figure followed silently at first, then the dragging grew faster, more purposeful. Branches snapped underfoot, hearts pounded, lungs burned. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into another clearing. Here, the forest seemed even stranger, almost wrong. Trees were gnarled, twisted in shapes that defied logic. In the center lay a circle of stones, charred as though burned recently. Around it, more carvings, deeper and more sinister than before, symbols that seemed to crawl when stared at. Do we go back?" Melissa asked, her voice shaking. "No," Jake said firmly, though fear clawed at him. "We keep moving. There has to be a trail somewhere." Suddenly, the figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long limbs that bent at angles they shouldn't. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its eyes, two faint glows locked onto them. It moved with unnatural speed, faster than any human could run, closing the distance in moments. The group scattered in panic, running blindly through the trees. Emily tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping her hands and knees. She heard Tyler scream behind her. She scrambled to her feet, shining her flashlight frantically. The beam caught a glimpse of something horrifying, a figure dragging Tyler into the shadows. His scream echoed and then abruptly stopped. Emily and Jake ran together, heart pounding, lungs burning. Melissa was close behind, sobbing, tripping over roots and underbrush. They stumbled into a narrow ravine, the walls steep and slippery. Trapped. Behind them, the creature's dragging steps echoed, closing in. In desperation, Jake spotted a fallen tree spanning the ravine. "Over here," he shouted. They clambered onto it, balancing precariously. The creature reached the edge, pausing, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It didn't leap, didn't attack, it just watched. Then, with a final low growl, it retreated into the darkness. They didn't move until dawn, huddled together on the fallen tree, too terrified to speak. When the sun rose, the forest seemed ordinary again, the shadows receding, birds chirping as if nothing had happened. But the carvings, twisted symbols, and the circle of stones remained, silent reminders of the night's horror. Eventually, they found the trail and made it back to their truck. The relief was overwhelming, though the trauma lingered. Tyler and Melissa were shaken into silence. Jake and Emily couldn't stop replaying the night in their minds. Back in civilization, they tried to warn others, but the forest swallowed their stories. Hikers shrugged, assuming it was fear or exhaustion. They couldn't explain the sounds, the carvings, or the creature. And when they checked maps later, the creek they had followed didn't exist, at least not where they had been. Emily never returned to the woods. Jake avoided the Appalachian trails entirely. Melissa and Tyler moved to another state, leaving the forest and its horrors behind. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear a faint dragging, a low, guttural growl, and remember that figure in the trees, waiting, watching, patient. The woods didn't care about them, about their fear. It had claimed them, if only in memory, a place where no one would ever believe what they had seen. Story the end. The forest was alive with the sound of cicadas, their droning chorus broken occasionally by the distant hoot of an owl. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the dense canopy, casting long, wavering shadows across the forest floor. 5 friends, Jake, Lisa, Mark, Sarah, and Ethan, had driven hours from their college town to camp in the remote hills of Pennsylvania. They had packed lightly, tents, sleeping bags, some food, a couple of flashlights, and a sense of reckless adventure. By the time they arrived, the air was thick with humidity, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles was strong. They found a clearing near a small creek and began setting up camp. Jake, the unofficial leader, took the lead in pitching tents, while Lisa and Sarah gathered firewood. Mark and Ethan scouted a short distance away for a spot to hang their food out of reach from wildlife. As night fell, the group sat around the fire, laughing and roasting marshmallows. Conversation drifted from the usual college gossip to the stories of local legends. Lisa, who had always been the most superstitious of the group, mentioned the tale of the Rattler, a supposed spirit of the forest that preyed on those who camped too deep into the woods. "Don't be ridiculous," Mark said with a smirk. "That's just a story to scare tourists." Sarah, shivering slightly in the cool night air, added, "Still, it's creepy being out here. I mean, there's no one around for miles." Jake laughed it off. "We're fine. Just a bunch of trees, maybe a raccoon or two, nothing more." They spent a few more hours around the fire, the flames casting eerie shadows across their faces. Eventually, they all decided to sleep, the forest seemingly settling into a quiet rhythm. But it wasn't long before the first strange noises began. At first, it was subtle, a rustling near the edge of the clearing, almost like the brush was moving on its own. Ethan, who had volunteered to keep watch, shined his flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. "Probably just a deer," he said, though his voice carried an unusual tension. Hours passed, and the group was mostly asleep when Lisa awoke to the sound of whispering. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. She nudged Sarah. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Sarah groaned. "It's probably just the wind, Lisa. Go back to sleep." But Lisa couldn't. The whispering continued, growing slightly more distinct. She sat up and looked around, the fire reduced to glowing embers. That's when she noticed footprints around the edge of the clearing, large, human-like, but oddly spaced, as if the creature was too tall to be human. She woke Jake. Jake frowned. "You're seeing things. There's no one here, probably just a raccoon messing with the firewood." But then the whispering grew closer. Low, guttural, almost forming words, yet not quite. It came from all around them. The hairs on the back of Jake's neck stood on end. Mark grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. For a moment, nothing. Then, in the distance, a figure, a man-shaped shadow, darted between the trees, too fast for a normal human. "Did you see that?" Mark hissed. Ethan, trying to keep calm, said, "It's probably a hunter or someone else camping nearby. Let's not panic." But panic had already set in. The whispering was now clearly coming from outside their tents, circling them. The friends huddled together, their earlier laughter and bravado evaporating into fear. Suddenly there was a scream, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the night. It was Sarah. Jake leapt from his tent, shining his flashlight toward her voice. He saw her lying on the ground, claw marks across her arms and legs. She was screaming, pointing toward the trees. Before anyone could react, the creature, or whatever it was, lunged at Mark. He barely dodged, stumbling backward and dropping his flashlight. In the dark, they could hear its breathing, heavy, wet, and inhuman. "Run!" Jake yelled. They grabbed what they could, flashlights, a couple of water bottles, and fled into the woods, the night swallowing them. Branches tore at their clothes and skin as they ran blindly, the whispering now joined by growls and the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. Ethan tripped over a root, sprawling onto the damp forest floor. The creature pounced, but Jake managed to shove him out of the way just in time. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a small, abandoned cabin hidden in a depression in the forest. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges, but it was their only refuge. They barricaded themselves inside with whatever they could find, hearts pounding, breaths coming in gasps. Through the cracks in the walls, they could hear it circling, scratching at the cabin, growling, whispering their names. The friends tried to stay quiet, holding hands, trembling. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Lisa, desperate to make sense of what was happening, whispered, "Maybe it's human, like a fugitive or something. We just need to wait it out until morning." Jake shook his head. "No human moves like that. And those sounds, it's not human." The creature's patience or hunger finally broke. The door splintered under a powerful strike. Jake, Sarah, Lisa, and Ethan scrambled, grabbing anything they could use as a weapon. A rusty chair leg, a broken table, a fire poker. The creature entered, its form barely visible in the dim light. A gaunt figure, unnaturally tall, its eyes glowing faintly. It lunged at them. Chaos erupted. Ethan swung the fire poker and connected with the creature's shoulder. It hissed, recoiling, but then advanced again. In the struggle, Sarah was grabbed, dragged toward the broken doorway. Her scream echoed as she was pulled into the darkness. Jake and Lisa managed to shove the creature back and escape through the side window, tumbling into the forest. They ran blindly, adrenaline pushing them through the pain of cuts and scratches. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by silence. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled onto a gravel road. A passing car stopped, the driver alarmed at their state. They screamed for help, pointing back into the woods, but when the driver shone a flashlight toward the trees, nothing was there. The authorities found no trace of Mark or Sarah. Searches of the area yielded nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence the group had even been camping there. Just the whispering wind and the faint smell of damp earth. Jake and Lisa were taken to a nearby hospital, shaken, bruised, and forever changed. The doctors and police were skeptical at first, thinking it was trauma-induced hallucination. But both Jake and Lisa were insistent. Something had been out there, something not human. Years later, Jake sometimes receives strange messages on his old phone, texts from unknown numbers, simple words like "run" or "I see you." Lisa reports occasional nightmares, waking to see shadows moving across her bedroom walls. Neither has returned to the woods, but the memory lingers like a scar. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, they swear they can still hear it, whispering their names from the darkness. Story the end. The wind rustled the tops of the pine trees as our group of 4 hikers trudged deeper into the forest. We had been planning this weekend trip for months. 2 tents, enough food to last a week, and a rough map sketched out by my cousin Dave, who claimed he knew the backwoods better than anyone. We left early Friday morning from our small town in Vermont, eager to escape the routine of work and school. Everything felt perfect until the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. We finally found a clearing by a small stream, far enough from the main trail that it felt like our own private campsite. Mark, my best friend since middle school, immediately started setting up his tent while Dave and I gathered firewood. Lisa, Mark's girlfriend, wandered near the stream, skipping stones and laughing at the way the sunlight glittered on the water. I noticed a sense of unease in the way the forest seemed unusually quiet. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the breeze felt heavier, carrying a faint, metallic smell I couldn't place. By the time we had the campfire going, night had fully settled in. Shadows danced across the clearing as we sat around the fire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories from past camping trips. Everything felt ordinary until I realized that the usual forest sounds, the distant calls of owls, rustling leaves from small critters, were almost entirely absent. Lisa pointed it out too, nervously twisting her hair. "Maybe it's just too late," she said, though her voice wavered. We laughed it off, trying to shake the creeping sense of being watched. But as the night deepened, the sensation only grew stronger. From the darkness beyond the firelight, I thought I saw something, a flicker, like a shadow moving between the trees. I blinked and it was gone. Mark shrugged. "Probably just a deer. Relax." We tried to ignore it, but then came the first real scare. A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees beyond the clearing. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost human. We froze. Dave motioned for us to stay quiet. The sound came again, closer this time, moving along the edge of the tree line. Lisa gripped my arm, whispering that we should just stay in the tent. I thought about hiking back to the car, but we were at least 2 miles in, and the trails would be impossible to navigate in the dark without flashlights. Instead, we huddled around the fire, trying to convince ourselves it was a bear, or maybe a coyote. But then we noticed something else. A faint light, maybe 50 feet into the trees, flickered intermittently. Not a flashlight, not a campfire, just a strange blue-white glow moving slowly. "Did anyone bring a lantern?" Dave asked, though we all knew the answer. None of us had. I suggested we ignore it, that it was probably someone else camping nearby, but no one else's voice replied to our thoughts. The forest was too quiet, too empty. The glow moved closer, shifting behind the trunks of the trees, but never fully revealing its source. Hours passed. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent us jumping. At some point, Lisa whispered she thought she saw figures, human-like, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at us. We dismissed it at first as shadows cast by the fire, but her fear was palpable. Mark, trying to be the tough guy, grabbed a long branch and ventured 30 feet into the darkness to scare off whatever might be out there. He didn't come back. We called his name, first softly, then shouting. The fire flickered violently as the wind picked up. Then we heard him screaming. Not the normal startled shout of someone tripping over a root or seeing a bear, but a scream full of terror, almost inhuman in pitch. It came from somewhere deep in the forest. We froze. The screams stopped suddenly, replaced by silence heavier than the night air itself. "Mark?" Dave whispered. No answer. Panic set in. We grabbed our backpacks and flashlights and ran toward the trail, thinking we could find the main path back to our car. But the forest had changed. Trees that should have been familiar now seemed taller, closer together. Every time we tried to follow the map, we ended up circling the same clearing. The stream was nowhere in sight. It was as if the woods themselves had shifted, rearranged, trapping us inside. And then we heard it. A voice. Quiet at first, barely audible over our pounding hearts, but unmistakably human. "Get out! Get out!" It came from all around us, echoing through the trees, though there was no one there. Lisa sobbed, clutching my arm. Dave swore under his breath and grabbed my hand, dragging us deeper into the forest, hoping to find the trail. The glow appeared again, now closer than ever, drifting between the trees. It illuminated a figure, tall, thin, unnaturally still, its head tilted unnaturally, eyes reflecting a blue light, its mouth moving in ways that shouldn't be human. We screamed and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks. Somehow, we found a small path that seemed like it could lead out, but the farther we went, the more we realized we were moving in circles again. The forest wasn't normal. It felt alive, twisting around us, hiding exits, showing only the path it wanted us to see. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The sky above had lost its stars, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The glow kept following us, keeping pace with our panicked sprints. The voice came again, now closer, clearer. You shouldn't be here. We finally tripped into a hollow clearing, and there he was, Mark, or what looked like him. His body was contorted, limbs bent at impossible angles, his face frozen in a scream. The glow emanated from his eyes, wide and unblinking. Before we could react, he, or it, screeched and lunged toward us. We ran without looking back, guided only by some primal sense of direction. We eventually stumbled onto the trail marked on the map. The forest behind us returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Normal trees, normal shadows, normal silence. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, breathless and covered in scratches from branches. We didn't speak for the entire drive back. The radio was dead the whole way home. No traffic, no other cars, no sound of civilization, just the dead static of the forest lingering in our ears. When we finally got back to town, the sun was rising. The forest looked innocent from the edge of the road, as if mocking what had happened. We reported Mark missing, but no search parties ever found him. Local authorities suggested he wandered off or fell into a ravine. But we knew better. We had all seen what he became. I haven't been back to the woods since. Neither have Dave or Lisa. And sometimes late at night I can still hear the faint guttural growls and the whispers calling my name, reminding me that the forest is still out there, waiting. Every year, around the same time we were in those woods, I get a message on my phone from an unknown number. Just one word, here. Story the end. The air was already cooling when we rolled into the parking area of Red Pine Campground, a small, wooded site tucked away in northern Pennsylvania. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, throwing long shadows across the clearing. 4 of us, me, my brother Jason, our friend Mike, and Mike's girlfriend Laura, had been talking about this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple weekend: camp, fish in the nearby creek, maybe hike a little. None of us had any idea how wrong it could go. We set up camp near the back of the site, where the trees grew thicker and the ground sloped gently down to the creek. The first few hours were normal. We pitched tents, built a fire, and cooked hot dogs and foil-wrapped potatoes. Laura, who had a habit of getting nervous in the woods, kept glancing over her shoulder, but we laughed it off. "It's just the woods," Jason said. "Nothing to worry about." We wanted to believe him. By 9 o'clock, the sky was dark, but the stars were bright and clear. The creek gurgled nearby, and the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. We sat around the fire, trading stories and sipping warm beer from our flasks. Then, as we were laughing at one of Mike's bad jokes, we heard something. Soft at first, almost like someone stepping on dry leaves far off in the woods. We froze. The noise stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. Jason said it was nothing, but Mike glanced toward the trees, frowning. Then it started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling around the perimeter of our campsite. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Every few seconds, a twig snapped. Laura's voice trembled. "Who's there?" she called, no answer. The footsteps continued. Jason got up, holding a flashlight. "Probably some hiker," he said, more to reassure us than himself. "I'll check it out." He swung the beam into the trees, but nothing moved. Then we all saw it, a shadow darting between the trunks, fast and silent. It wasn't an animal. It moved upright, like a person. "Jason, don't go," I started, but it was too late. He followed the shadow. For a moment the forest was still again, and then we heard Jason scream. Not a shout, a scream that cut through the night like glass. Mike grabbed the firewood and ran toward him, with Laura and I close behind. What we saw made our blood run cold. Jason was on the ground, his flashlight rolling away, and the shadow, or whatever it was, stood over him. It was dark, featureless, almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its head moved in jerky, unnatural motions. Jason tried to crawl away, but it was fast, faster than anything human could be. Then it vanished. Just like that. Jason was on the ground, trembling, his clothes torn, scratches on his arms. He couldn't speak at first, just pointing back into the woods, eyes wide with terror. It watches, he finally stammered. Always watches. We didn't sleep that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set us on edge. Around 3 a.m., I swear I heard breathing outside my tent, low and raspy. Laura cried quietly, and Mike kept whispering that we should leave, that we should drive back to town. Jason, pale and shaking, refused to go out again. The next day, we tried to convince ourselves it had been a nightmare. Uh, Maybe we had seen a person with bad intentions. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by fatigue and too much beer. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time one of us walked a few feet into the trees, something seemed to follow just beyond the edge of our vision. We went fishing at the creek, trying to act normal. The sun was out, birds were singing, and yet the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. That's when we noticed the marks. Long, deep scratches in the bark of the trees, claw-like but far too large for any bear. They were fresh, the woods still wet and dark. Mike tried to laugh it off. "Probably a bear," he said, but none of us believed him. Bears don't move like shadows, and they don't disappear into thin air. By the evening, the sense of dread had become unbearable. Jason refused to go outside the tent at all, shaking if the wind blew too hard. Laura cried herself to sleep, and I barely slept at all. Then we heard it again, footsteps circling the campsite, slow and deliberate. But this time, we weren't frozen in place. We grabbed whatever weapons we had, sticks, a hatchet, even rocks. And then it came into view. The shadow moved between the trees, towering over everything. It didn't have a face, just a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. It didn't run, it just glided closer, limbs twitching unnaturally. I remember thinking how wrong it looked, how impossible it seemed, and yet it was real. Jason screamed and ran toward the car parked near the entrance, and I followed him. Laura stayed back, too terrified to move. As we reached the edge of the clearing, the shadow vanished again, leaving behind only the echo of movement and a cold, heavy silence. We didn't stop to argue. We threw our gear in the car, Jason driving, me in the passenger seat, heart hammering in my chest. We didn't even wait for Laura, who followed minutes later in a separate car Mike had driven. As we left Red Pine behind, the forest seemed to swallow itself, silent and still, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. When we got back to town, we reported what happened to the local ranger station. They listened politely, but told us there were no known reports of any intruders, no missing persons, no attacks. "You must have been seeing things," one ranger said, but none of us have ever doubted what we saw. Weeks later, we found scratches on Jason's bedroom window, deep enough to catch your fingernail. The same long, impossibly wide marks as the trees back at Red Pine. No one could explain them. No one could explain the sense of being watched that followed us back home. We never returned to that campground. We never camped together again. And every time I hear a branch snap outside my window at night, I think about those dark, twisted limbs gliding silently between the trees, always watching, always waiting. Even now, years later, I still wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that shadow is there somewhere, just beyond the edge of the light. It's out there, in the woods, in the shadows, and it's patient. It doesn't need to attack. It just needs to watch. And somehow, I know it's still following me, just beyond the corner of my vision, waiting for the next time I dare to enter the woods. Story the end. The rain had already turned the dirt road into a river of mud by the time I pulled up to the campsite. My cousin Mark and I had planned the trip for months, 3 days in the remote woods of northern Maine, far from towns, people, and responsibility. The kind of place where the nearest help was 20 miles of forest away. He arrived before me, and his truck was already parked by the tree line. The sky was low and heavy, thick with the kind of clouds that made dusk feel like midnight. I found him crouched by the fire ring, stacking soaked twigs with a stubborn determination that only Mark could have. He grinned when he saw me, brushing the rainwater from his hair. "Thought you bailed," he said. "Not a chance," I replied, throwing my pack down. But as I said it, something in the woods caught my eye. A shape, just for a moment, moving between the trees, too tall to be a deer. I blinked, and it vanished. I said nothing. We pitched our tents under a cluster of towering spruce trees and tried to get a fire going. The rain slowed, then stopped, and the forest around us came alive with the hiss of wet leaves and the distant call of loons. For a while, it felt peaceful, normal. We cooked over the weak fire, warmed our hands, and talked about old childhood memories. Around 10 p.m., the dark settled in thick and absolute, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything outside the flickering light of the flames. I heard it first, a long, low creaking sound from somewhere in the woods. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a tree bending under enormous weight, but slower, more controlled. The kind of sound wood makes right before snapping. Mark heard it too. He shot me a look. Wind? He offered. There is no wind, I said quietly. The noise stopped as suddenly as it began. We stayed close to the fire until it burned low, neither of us wanting to be the first to suggest sleep. My nerves were already tight, and every shift of shadow between the trunks made me grip the flashlight harder. Eventually, exhaustion won. We retreated to our tents. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft tapping sound on the canvas above my head. Not rain. Not branches. Tapping, measured, spaced like knuckles on a door. I held my breath. It stopped. A moment passed. Then it scraped, something dragging across the tent, slow and deliberate. I whispered, "Mark," but there was no answer. I reached for my knife and unzipped the tent a fraction of an inch. The air was freezing and the forest outside was still. Too still. Something moved along the path near the trees, tall, almost the height of a doorway. This time I saw it clearly. Broad shoulders, impossibly long arms, a head that tilted in unnatural jerks, like it didn't fully understand how to mimic human movement. Its skin looked pale, almost gray in the moonlight. It disappeared into the trees without a sound. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I zipped the tent again and stayed awake until morning. When dawn finally came, I staggered out to find Mark already up, pale and shaking. "Something was outside my tent," he said before I could speak. "I heard it breathing." We both agreed not to stay another night. But before we could break down the tents, we noticed something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare human-like footprints, but longer, narrower, with toes that curved like claws. They circled both tents, then led back into the forest. We packed in silence. Before leaving, Mark insisted on checking a nearby ridge where he thought he saw someone watching us around sunrise. I told him we should just go, but he was stubborn and already hiking up the sloped trail. I followed him reluctantly, glancing back every few steps. At the top, the view opened to an old logging clearing, abandoned machinery covered in moss, rusted trucks, stacks of rotted timber. The place felt wrong, the kind of wrong you feel deep in your bones. That was when I smelled it, something foul, like rotting meat left out in the sun. The air felt heavy, thick. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked suddenly. At first, I didn't. Then it hit me, a faint crying sound, a woman crying. Soft, broken. It was coming from the tree line at the far end of the clearing. "No," I whispered. "We're not going there." But Mark was already moving. I grabbed his arm, but he pulled away. "It might be someone hurt," he said. I followed him, cursing under my breath. As we got closer, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was wrong, total and absolute. Even the birds had gone quiet. We reached the edge of the trees. There was nothing there. Then something snapped a branch behind us. We spun around. The tall figure stepped into the clearing, standing between us and the trail back to camp. Its head tilted slowly, studying us. I could hear it breathing, wet, labored, a rattling inhale followed by a low, vibratory exhale. Mark whispered, "Don't run." But I could see the thing tense like a predator preparing to lunge. "Run," I hissed. We bolted through the trees. Branches clawed at our clothes and skin. I didn't dare look back, but I heard it. The heavy loping footsteps behind us, faster than they should be. Too fast. It moved like something that had lived in the forest its entire life. We burst onto the path near the tents. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. Mark tripped over a root and slammed into the dirt. I grabbed his arm and yanked him up. The creature let out a sound, something between a moan and a growl, deep enough to vibrate the ground. We made it to the car. The keys shook in my hand as I unlocked it. Mark dove in, yelling for me to hurry. As I yanked open the driver's door, I saw it emerge from the trees again, closer than it should have been, arms hanging like loose branches. I floored the gas. We didn't stop until we hit the main road. For the first few days after we got home, we didn't talk about it, not even a text. Then Mark called me one night, voice trembling. He said he'd heard tapping on his bedroom window even though he lived on the second floor. He said he'd seen something pale standing across the street under a streetlight, watching. I told him not to open the curtains, not to look, to just stay inside. 2 days later, his neighbor found his apartment door wide open, lights on, and Mark gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing disturbed except the window, which was cracked open, the glass scratched, long marks etched into the frame like it had been pried apart by something with inhuman hands. The police filed him as missing. They questioned me. They searched the woods. They found nothing. But last week, a package showed up at my door. No return address. Inside was a small leather pouch. When I opened it, my hands went numb. Inside were footprints, his footprints, cast perfectly in dried mud, the same mud from that forest. Now every night, I hear tapping. Sometimes on the window, sometimes on the door, sometimes from inside the walls. Whatever followed us out of those woods doesn't stop. It waits. It learns. And now it knows where I live. Story the end. The sky had been in an unbroken sheet of gray when we first drove into the parking lot of the campground. I remember the smell of wet pine needles and mud that clung to the tires of our old minivan as we unloaded the tent, sleeping bags, and cooler. There were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Tyler, his younger sister Megan, and our cousins Jake and Sam. We'd been planning this trip for months, a getaway from the suffocating routine of suburban life. Everyone was in high spirits, joking about how we were going to rough it in the woods, though none of us had ever done more than pitch a tent in our backyard. The campground was almost deserted. Most of the spots were empty, the few campers around keeping to themselves. We claimed a site near the far edge where the trees grew thick and the river was just a short walk away. The ranger had warned us about staying on marked trails, especially after dusk, but we laughed it off. Adventure awaited, we thought, not trouble. By the time we had the tent set up, the sun was slipping below the tree line. Tyler and Jake went to gather firewood while Megan and I arranged the cooler and unpacked supplies. Sam, true to his nature, had already disappeared into the woods with his camera, muttering something about documenting nature. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual chirping of birds was subdued as if the woods were holding their breath. We started a fire as darkness crept in. Shadows stretched long and warped in the flickering light. We roasted hot dogs, sipped from cans of soda, and tried to ignore the occasional snap of twigs from deeper in the forest. Tyler swore he heard someone whisper his name, but when we looked, there was nothing. I chalked it up to imagination, though a chill ran down my spine. That night, around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and our tent flapped violently. Megan woke screaming, claiming she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. We rushed out with flashlights, but the woods were empty. Only the shadows of trees danced in the beams of light. We tried to calm her, telling her it was just our minds playing tricks in the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, Sam was gone. Not just wandering or exploring, gone. His camera lay on the picnic table, its lens cracked, and a single frame was left on the SD card. It was a blurry image, but in it, a dark shape crouched among the trees, too tall and thin to be human. Panic set in. We called his phone, screamed his name, and even searched along the riverbank, but there was no sign of him. We debated leaving, but the old roads were washed out from recent rains, and our cell service was spotty at best. By mid-afternoon, Tyler and Jake had gone to search again, leaving Megan and me behind. The forest felt alive in a way that was suffocating, like the trees themselves were watching. Shadows moved just beyond our vision, and the silence pressed down on us. Then, a low, wet growl echoed from the river, followed by the sound of splashing. Tyler and Jake didn't return. We waited through the night, huddled by the fire, listening to branches snap and distant guttural noises that made my stomach churn. Every time I blinked, I thought I saw movement just beyond the light of the fire. I refused to leave the safety of the circle of flames, though the fire burned low. Megan kept crying softly, clutching a knife she had found in the cooler. By the third night, desperation was sinking in. We had no food left, no way to call for help, and the river had risen, turning the small path into a muddy, impassable mess. Then, I saw them. The figures. Tall, emaciated shapes with grayish skin that clung to their bones, eyes glinting unnaturally in the moonlight. They moved with impossible speed, gliding rather than walking. One was crouched near the edge of our firelight, tilting its head in a way that felt intelligent. It was studying us. We ran, abandoning the tent and supplies. The underbrush tore at our clothes and skin, but we didn't stop. We ran until the forest seemed endless, until exhaustion forced us to hide in the hollow of a fallen tree. We could hear them moving around, sniffing, whispering, clicking noises that set every nerve on edge. Megan kept her mouth shut, tears streaking her dirt-covered face. I tried to hold her hand, but the moment I touched her, she jerked away as if afraid the creatures could sense touch. Morning didn't bring relief. The sun barely penetrated the canopy, and the forest was still alive with the sounds of those things. We moved cautiously, trying to find the road. That's when we found them, the remnants of previous campers. Torn tents, shredded backpacks, personal items scattered and covered in mud. There were marks, deep gouges in the bark of trees, as if someone or something had dragged people up the trunks. The reality hit. This was not an ordinary forest, and we were not going to simply walk out. We decided to follow the river, hoping it would lead us to civilization. Hours passed. The creatures stalked us, always just beyond sight, always whispering in that low, guttural tone that made our heads spin. When we stumbled upon a small clearing, we found footprints. Not ours. Human-like, but elongated, with an extra set of toes. Megan whispered they were not people, and I had to agree, though my throat burned with fear. By nightfall, we were exhausted and starving. We built a small fire, trying to make ourselves visible in case anyone came to help. That night, the creatures came closer. They circled the clearing, never entering the light, but their whispers were now words. Our names. My name. Megan's name. Tyler. Jake. Sam. They knew us. They knew everything about us. I couldn't sleep, too afraid that closing my eyes for even a second meant never waking up. On the fourth day, we stumbled upon a ranger's cabin, abandoned but with signs of recent habitation. Inside, we found notes hastily scribbled, warning that the forest was alive and that those who stayed too long never returned. Some notes were in different handwriting, older, warning about the creatures and how they preyed on anyone venturing off trail. The last note, smeared in blood, read, "They remember. They wait. Don't try to run." We tried to stay in the cabin, but the creatures were relentless. By nightfall, the windows were covered in claw marks, and we could hear breathing from the attic. We barricaded ourselves as best we could, but it didn't matter. The door splintered in the early hours of dawn, and I saw them for the first time clearly. Tall, skeletal, faces stretched in permanent snarls, limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. One reached for Megan. I screamed, grabbed a log, and hit it with everything I had. The fire flared, and for a moment they recoiled. That was our chance. We ran. The rest is a blur. We ran through mud, water, underbrush, following the sound of distant traffic, until finally the trees thinned. We emerged onto a county road just as a car rounded the bend. The driver stopped, staring at us, disheveled, bleeding, clothes torn, eyes wide with terror. We didn't even speak. We climbed in and didn't look back. The forest was behind us, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Tyler, Jake, and Sam were never found. Megan and I barely speak about what happened. I've tried to warn others, tried to tell the authorities, but no one believes a story about creatures that whisper your name and drag people into the woods. They think it's stress, panic, imagination. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I still hear the whisper of my name carried on the wind, promising that they are still out there, waiting. Story the end. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. My friends and I had driven deep into the Appalachian backwoods, somewhere in West Virginia, chasing the idea of a perfect weekend escape from city life. I'd grown up camping, but this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation, or the fact that cell service vanished like it had never existed. We set up camp beside a creek, its water reflecting the moonlight in jagged silver streaks, and built a fire. We joked and drank beer, the smoke curling into the night sky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the crackling of the fire fading into silence. My friends were all asleep, sprawled across their sleeping bags. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was sharper, too deliberate. Then I heard it, a low, almost human groan that echoed through the trees. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a deer. It was slow, deliberate, and it came from the direction of the creek. I shook my head and told myself it was an animal. Bears weren't uncommon here. But the groaning didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I nudged Josh awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He rolled over, bleary-eyed, and laughed. "It's just the wind, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I sat there, staring into the blackness of the trees, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, careful, dragging through the underbrush. They weren't the quick scurrying steps of a deer or raccoon. These were deliberate, human-like, but heavier. By morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. We hiked to a nearby ridge, but even the daylight didn't make me feel safe. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but the memory of those footsteps lingered. Around midday, as we set up a makeshift camp for lunch, I noticed something odd. Our fire pit from the previous night had been disturbed. Not much, just a small pile of dirt tossed over the ashes, like someone had been here after us. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem paranoid. As we sat eating, Josh joked about local legends of creepers in the woods, some myth about a man who watches campers and follows them for days before striking. I laughed nervously, but deep down, the thought gnawed at me. By late afternoon, we decided to hike further in, chasing a waterfall a few miles away. The trail became narrow, almost hidden by undergrowth, and it felt like the forest itself was closing in. Around 5 p.m., we found the waterfall. It was beautiful, misting the rocks, and I tried to lose myself in the view, but the feeling of being watched returned stronger than before. Then Josh let out a yell. We turned to see him pointing at something in the trees across the creek, a figure, tall, gaunt, clothed in tattered fabric that blended with the shadows, just standing there watching us. When we tried to focus on it, it vanished, slipping behind the thick forest like it had never been there. We hurried back to camp, hearts racing, and tried to convince each other it was a deer or a trick of the light. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every whisper of the wind sounded like movement closer to the tents. Around 1 a.m., I heard the fire crackle from outside my tent, even though I knew it had burned out hours ago. I unzipped the flap slowly. The fire pit was glowing faintly. Embers stirred, but no one was there. I woke Josh and Alex. We stayed up, armed with flashlights and a hunting knife Josh had brought. Hours passed with nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it was just nerves, that we were letting our imaginations run wild. I tried to sleep, but when I did, I had a nightmare. A figure, emaciated, with hollow eyes and twisted fingers, dragging a camper into the woods. I woke to the sound of whispering, soft, almost inaudible. It wasn't outside the tent. It was inside my head. The next morning, we packed up, eager to leave. As we hiked back to the car, the path seemed longer, the forest denser. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. Around noon, we reached a clearing where the trail met the road. Relief washed over me. I swore I saw movement in the tree line, a shadow slipping behind a tree, but I didn't speak of it. Back at my apartment, weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory. I tried rational explanations, exhaustion, imagination, stress. But then I started noticing things. My mail was sometimes slightly disturbed. Once my front door was unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it. My friends laughed when I mentioned it, calling me paranoid. One night I woke to a noise downstairs. My apartment was small, and the noise sounded deliberate, like someone was pacing. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the living room. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints. But then I noticed it. Scratches on my hardwood floor, fresh, not old. The scratches were long, deep, claw-like, but not quite. I couldn't explain them. Days later, Josh called, sounding nervous. He told me that he and Alex had returned to the area near the creek. Not intentionally, just for nostalgia, and found the fire pit from our first night had been rebuilt. Fresh wood, embers still warm. Nothing else. No footprints leading away, no signs of human presence. Just a fire, waiting. I stopped going to the woods. I stopped camping entirely. But sometimes late at night, I hear faint footsteps outside my window, soft, dragging. Shadows pass along my walls. I've moved apartments twice, and every time the feeling follows, the presence lurking just beyond the threshold. A month ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small pile of dirt, ash mixed in. I recognized it immediately, our old fire pit from that first night. No note, no explanation, just the dirt. Now I sleep with a light on and a knife by my bed. I never walk alone, never go near the woods. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window at shadows in the trees across the street. I tell myself it's paranoia, but I know better. That thing, whatever it is, follows, remembers, waits. Friends stopped camping too. We don't talk about that trip much. When we do, it's awkward silence, a shiver down the spine. None of us have returned to those woods, and none of us will. Because whatever we saw, or whatever saw us, never forgets. Every sound in the dark makes me jump. Every night I hear whispering, and sometimes, just sometimes, I see a flash of movement at the edge of my vision. Tall, gaunt, and waiting. I thought leaving the woods would be enough, but it wasn't. It's everywhere now. In my house, in my dreams, in the spaces where I should feel safe. It doesn't care about distance. It doesn't care about time. It only waits. And one night I know I'll hear that dragging step outside my door. I'll hear the groan that isn't wind or animal, and I'll know it's come for me. Story the end. The forest had an early chill that October evening, the kind that made your breath visible and your skin feel raw, even under layers of fleece. 4 friends, Jake, Lisa, Matt, and Sarah, had decided to escape the city for a weekend camping trip in the remote Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. They drove for hours along winding roads until the trees grew so dense it felt like the sunlight itself was being swallowed. They laughed and joked in the car, the kind of easy camaraderie that only comes from years of knowing someone, unaware that it would be the last night any of them would feel completely safe. They reached their campsite just before dusk. It was a small clearing near a river, surrounded by towering pine and birch. The air smelled damp and earthy. They unpacked, pitched their tents, and gathered firewood. Jake, the unofficial leader of the group, started the fire while Matt and Lisa set up the tents, and Sarah unpacked their food. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows into the surrounding darkness. As the night deepened, the forest became a symphony of strange noises. Leaves rustled, though there was no wind. Twigs snapped underfoot in the distance, though no one had moved beyond the clearing. A hoot of an owl echoed somewhere far off, but it didn't sound alone. Lisa, sitting by the fire, shivered. "I don't like how quiet it gets out here," she said, but laughed it off when the others teased her for being paranoid. Around 11 p.m., after a few beers, they decided to call it a night. Matt and Sarah went into their tent while Jake and Lisa stayed by the fire a little longer, drinking coffee. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural growl from the trees behind them. At first they thought it was a bear, but it wasn't loud enough. The sound seemed deliberate, measured, as though something was stalking them. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, eyes wide. Jake tried to mask his unease. "Probably just a raccoon, nothing to worry about." But then came the rustling, not random wind, not the casual movement of animals, slow, deliberate steps crunching through leaves. Jake grabbed a flashlight and swung it toward the tree line. The beam caught on a figure, tall, hunched, standing unnaturally still. Lisa screamed, ducking behind Jake. "What the hell is that?" Jake didn't answer. The figure didn't move at first, then began stepping toward them. Its gait was off, jerky, unnatural. They didn't see a face, only long arms swinging loosely at its sides. The fire flickered as if afraid. "Run," Jake finally said, and they sprinted to their tent. Inside, Matt and Sarah were confused, hearing the panic in their friends' voices. They could hear it outside too now, a scraping, like nails against bark, moving closer. The friends huddled together, hearts pounding, the tent walls trembling with every step outside. The sounds moved around their campsite in a circle, never fully revealing themselves, never leaving. Every time they dared to shine a flashlight outside, the beam caught a flash of blackness in the trees, always just at the edge of visibility. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed suspended in the dark, tense silence punctuated by the growls and footsteps. By 2 a.m., the fire had burned down to embers. They were cold, terrified, and hungry, but no one dared to leave the tent. Around 3 a.m., the growling stopped. The forest seemed to inhale, a silence so profound it made their ears ring. Relief washed over them, but it was fleeting. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate, on the side of their tent. Not one, not two, but slow, rhythmic thumps, like something testing the fabric. "Maybe it's a tree branch," Matt said, trying to stay calm, but his voice shook. Lisa shook her head. "Branches don't knock like that." Then a whisper, barely audible, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but unmistakable. "Out." The 4 of them froze. The voice came from right outside the tent, low and rasping, the kind of voice that doesn't belong to a human. Panic consumed them. They grabbed their phones, but there was no signal, no way out. Suddenly, the tent's zipper began to move on its own, slowly, methodically. They could see a dark shape pressing against the fabric, and it was big, too big to be human. Jake tried to hold the zipper shut, but the shape pushed, forcing it open. A scream tore from Sarah's throat as a shadow fell across the tent. Then, nothing. Silence. Shaking, the friends peeked outside. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty. The fire pit held cold ashes, the logs blackened, but they weren't safe yet. In the morning, they would find tracks around the campsite. Huge footprints, more like claws, circling their tents as if marking territory. When dawn came, they packed in a hurry, not speaking much. The forest seemed calm in the sunlight, deceivingly normal. On the drive back, they tried to rationalize what happened. A bear, maybe? Or some crazy person? But none of them could explain the growls, the voice, or the sheer impossibility of the size of the creature. Back in the city, life resumed, but the memory lingered. Every dark corner, every rustle in the park reminded them of that night. They swore never to return to those woods. Weeks later, Jake's uncle, a lifelong hunter, called him. He had been tracking reports of missing hikers and odd sightings in the Adirondacks. People don't go missing out there without a reason, he said. Some of the older folks talk about something they call the tall man of the pines. Nobody knows what it is, but they say it hunts in packs and doesn't like humans trespassing in its woods. The friends looked at each other, dread settling in. Maybe it wasn't just the Adirondacks being quiet at night. Maybe something truly inhuman was out there, and it had marked them. Months later, Sarah vanished. She had gone hiking near the river where they camped, just like old times. Her friends searched, filed reports, but no trace was ever found. Then Lisa started receiving voicemails on her phone. Short, raspy, the voice from the tent. It said one word each time, out. Jake and Matt never camped again. They stayed away from forests, stayed in cities with lights and crowds. But every once in a while, when the wind blew through the trees outside their windows, they could swear they heard steps circling their apartment, long arms dragging across the pavement, keeping them marked, reminding them that they had trespassed once, and it had not forgotten. Even now, years later, they can't bring themselves to speak the name of what they saw. They only call it the thing in the woods, and sometimes, late at night, they can still hear it whispering. Story the end. The sun was already starting to dip behind the thick pines when we finally found a clearing big enough to set up camp. It had taken all afternoon to hike in from the trailhead, loaded down with tents, sleeping bags, and enough food to last the weekend. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine resin filled the air, and there was a strange stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. My friends, Matt, Sarah, and Josh, were trying to set up the tents, but the ground was uneven and littered with roots. I dropped my pack and leaned against a tree, taking in the quiet. The first thing we noticed was the way the woods seemed darker than usual, even with the fading sunlight. The trees were unnaturally close together, branches tangled high above, blocking out the sky. I joked about it being the haunted forest trail, but nobody laughed. Matt wandered off to collect firewood. Sarah tried to get a small fire going, and Josh fiddled with the cooler. As night fell, the forest came alive in a way that was almost hypnotic. Crickets chirped, an owl called somewhere above, and the wind rustled through the branches. We sat around the fire telling stories, trying to ignore the creeping chill that had nothing to do with temperature. I noticed shadows moving just beyond the ring of firelight, but when I pointed them out, no one else saw anything. Later, after we had eaten, Matt said he wanted to go for a quick walk down the trail to scout for a better firewood spot. I offered to go with him, but he waved me off. "Nah, it's fine, just a few minutes," he said. Sarah and Josh stayed by the fire, laughing and joking to keep the mood light. The first scream was muffled but piercing. I didn't hear it clearly, just a sharp, terrified yelp, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Josh and Sarah froze, staring into the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the trail. "Matt," I called, my voice shaking. There was silence, and then another scream, closer this time. A sound like a human, but twisted, desperate, almost animal. We ran toward the noise, but it didn't lead us to Matt. Instead, we found the ground torn up like something had struggled. A piece of his jacket was caught on a root, ripped clean off, no footprints, no blood, just the fabric flapping in the wind and the strange stillness of the trees. Sarah started crying. Josh swore he saw a figure dart behind a tree. but when I shone the light, nothing was there. We ran back to the campsite, locking ourselves inside the tents. That night, sleep was impossible. Every crackle of branches, every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like someone or something was moving closer. At some point, we heard whispering. Not one voice, but many, soft, just beyond comprehension. It was in English, but it wasn't words you could understand. Something was trying to communicate. At dawn, we tried to leave. We packed up quickly, hearts pounding, but when we stepped onto the trail, it wasn't the one we'd hiked in on. The landmarks were wrong. The forest looked the same in every direction. Panic set in. I tried to use my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. Even the sun's position didn't match the map. We were trapped in some kind of loop, walking in circles, the trees looming like silent sentinels. By midday, hunger and exhaustion were setting in. We argued, voices sharp and frantic. Josh wanted to keep moving, convinced there had to be a way out if we just kept walking. Sarah begged to stay put, hoping someone would find us. I was caught between them, trying to stay rational, but the forest didn't make sense. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally. Sounds echoed as if from far away, even when something was right next to us. The second night was worse. The whispering returned, louder this time. Shapes moved just beyond the firelight. We caught glimpses. Tall, humanoid, impossibly thin. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. They didn't move like animals, more like shadows sliding across the ground. We huddled together, trying to convince ourselves it was exhaustion or imagination. But deep down, we knew it was something else, something alive. Around midnight, we heard Matt's voice. It was faint but unmistakable, calling our names. Relief surged through us. We followed it, stumbling through the undergrowth until we found him, or at least something wearing his jacket. He was crouched behind a fallen log, shaking violently. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there were cuts on his arms that hadn't been there before. "It's out there," he whispered. "They're watching, always watching." We didn't argue. We stuck together, trying to backtrack the way we thought we had come. The forest was a maze, and every time we thought we recognized a path, the trees rearranged themselves. Hours passed like minutes, minutes like hours. We found signs of other campers, abandoned tents, rusted cans, old footprints, but all of it decayed, as if it had been left decades ago, though some items looked new. By the third day, desperation had set in. Food was gone and our water bottles were empty. Our nerves were shredded. That night, something actually entered our camp. Not a shadow, not a whisper, but a presence. We felt it before we saw it, cold, heavy, oppressive. Branches snapped around us. Then we heard breathing. Close. Very close. Josh screamed and shone his flashlight toward the trees, and for a split second, we saw it. It was human-shaped, but grotesque. Limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way, skin pale and slick, eyes like black pits. It tilted its head, watching us, and then it vanished, as though swallowed by the forest itself. We didn't move for hours, too terrified to even whisper. On the fourth day, something finally broke. Sarah ran, just bolted into the trees without warning. We called after her, but she didn't respond. That was the last we saw of her. We followed her path for hours, but it led nowhere. The forest refused to let us find her, and eventually we were forced to return to the empty campsite, broken and silent. We decided we had to keep moving, keep walking, hoping against hope that the edge of the forest would appear. Hours later, we stumbled into a clearing that didn't exist on any map, filled with broken tents and remnants of campers long gone. Names carved into trees, dates etched into rocks, some as old as a century. Each mark felt like a warning. And then we saw a new set of footprints, fresh, leading toward us. Thin, long, human-like, and surrounding us in an unnatural circle. Panic overwhelmed reason. Matt screamed something, I don't even remember what, and we ran blindly. The forest shifted, or maybe we were too disoriented to tell the difference. We ran until our legs gave out. When we finally stopped, it was night again. The same whispering surrounded us, closer than ever. Then we heard it, Sarah's voice, calling, but distorted, wrong, like it was coming from underwater. We followed the voice, praying it was real. But instead of Sarah, we found a clearing filled with dozens of shadowy figures, crouched, waiting. Matt froze, and I grabbed him, but it was too late. The figures circled us, whispering. The words finally became clear. Stay. With us. I don't remember much after that. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Matt reaching for me, screaming, and then the shadows enveloping us. When I woke, I was alone. The sun was high in the sky, and the forest looked normal again, almost serene. My phone had service. My friends' numbers showed no recent calls. Their packs and tents were gone, as if they had never existed. I stumbled back to the trailhead, disoriented, exhausted. When I got to the nearest ranger station, I told them what happened. They looked at me like I was insane. "Which trail?" the ranger asked. The the one near Pine Hollow, I said. The ranger shook his head. "There's no Pine Hollow trail here, not in this forest. You're lucky to be alive." I never went camping again. I don't know what took my friends or what I saw in those woods, but sometimes late at night I can still hear the whispering, soft and endless, calling my name, promising I'll return. Story the end. It was the last weekend of September when four friends, Mike, Jenna, Chris, and Lila, decided to escape the city for a weekend of camping in the Appalachian Mountains. The drive up was filled with jokes, playlists of classic rock, and the occasional argument over whose snacks were better. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers across the gravel path. The forest smelled crisp, the air damp with early fall moisture. They hoisted their packs and followed the trail markers toward a small clearing that Chris had found on a hiking forum. According to the map and forum posts, it was a perfect spot, isolated enough to feel like they had the woods to themselves, yet close enough to a river for water. By the time they arrived, twilight was settling in. The clearing was more overgrown than Chris had described, with brambles and tall grass that had overtaken the ground. Still, they managed to pitch two tents side by side and gather enough dry wood to start a fire. Jenna, who always claimed she had the best luck, struck the first match, and a warm glow spread across their faces as they sat down on logs and rocks. As the night deepened, the forest grew alive with sound. Owls hooted in the distance, the rustle of small animals skittered through the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the trees. At first it felt magical, almost comforting. Then, subtly, it began to change. Chris thought he heard footsteps off the trail, the kind that didn't sound like deer or raccoons. "Guys," he whispered, pointing into the darkness, "did you hear that?" Mike chuckled, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's a forest, man. Everything makes noise." But Jenna's unease grew. She didn't like being so deep in the woods, not with night closing in. Lila, ever the fearless one, laughed. "Come on, it's nothing. Just enjoy the fire, drink some hot cocoa." They tried to settle down, but the sounds persisted, slightly off, irregular, like someone walking around the perimeter of their clearing. Occasionally, they thought they glimpsed movement just beyond the reach of the firelight. By 11 p.m., the group decided to call it a night. Mike and Chris stayed up a little longer, joking quietly about ghost stories and supposed Bigfoot sightings in the region. Jenna and Lila went to their tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, a loud crack echoed through the trees. It was distinct, deliberate, unlike the natural sounds of the forest. The group jumped, and the fire flared up as if startled by the noise. Mike grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the source, but all he saw were dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, approached their clearing. It wasn't the shuffle of small animals. This was something bigger, something deliberate. "Probably just some hunters," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe someone's lost." "Hunters at midnight?" Jenna whispered, gripping Lila's arm. "In this part of the woods?" The footsteps paused, then circled closer, moving with a rhythm that didn't make sense. It wasn't natural. It wasn't random. Suddenly, a low growl emanated from the darkness. It was guttural, inhuman, and it froze them in place. The hairs on Jenna's neck stood on end. Lila grabbed a rock, ready to throw it, but her hands were shaking. Then the firelight flickered, and for a brief moment they saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, humanoid, but distorted. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its eyes seemed to catch the firelight in a way that glowed faintly red. They blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the snapping of twigs behind. Panic set in. Mike fumbled with his phone, but there was no signal. None of them could call for help. "Pack up," Jenna whispered urgently. "We leave now." They scrambled to gather their things, the sound of breaking branches and distant footsteps echoing in their ears. As they tried to make their way back to the trailhead, they realized something terrifying. Every direction they tried seemed to lead them deeper into the woods. Landmarks they had passed on the way in were gone. The trail markers didn't exist anymore. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. They couldn't tell. The forest had swallowed all sense of time. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that seemed to follow them, almost mirroring their every move. Their flashlights flickered intermittently, creating bursts of illumination that revealed nothing but trees, thick brush, and the feeling of being watched. Then came the whispers. Low, almost human, but distorted. They didn't speak words, just syllables that felt like warnings. Get out, leave, never. They seemed to come from all around them. Chris grabbed Lila's hand, but the pressure didn't calm him. He felt like they were being herded. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into another clearing, this one even darker, the moonlight barely penetrating the canopy. And there, etched into the dirt, were footprints. Too large to be human, clawed, deep. They weren't alone. Jenna screamed when they noticed movement in the trees. Shadows shifted unnaturally, branches bent without wind, and the ground trembled slightly as if the forest itself were alive. The growls came again, closer, this time multiple voices. Chris tried to rationalize. It's probably a bear. It has to be. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The way the noises moved, how they seemed to anticipate their movements. It was hunting them. They ran blindly, branches scratching their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Jenna fell and scraped her knee badly, blood mixing with the mud. Lila helped her up, but the sound of pursuit grew louder. Finally, they spotted a small river that wasn't on any of their maps. They followed it, hoping it would lead to civilization. The footsteps behind them never stopped. If anything, they got faster, more aggressive. As they ran along the riverbank, Chris tripped and fell, twisting his ankle. The group tried to pull him up, but a shadow loomed above them. They didn't wait to see what it was. Adrenaline pushed them forward, splashing through the cold water until the sound of movement behind them faded into silence. By dawn, they stumbled out of the woods onto a dirt service road, exhausted, bleeding, and barely conscious. They didn't stop until they saw a small gas station and called the authorities. Search parties combed the area, but they found nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there except the four of them. In the weeks after, the friends tried to return to normal life, but none of them could shake the memory of those glowing eyes, the whispers, and the feeling of being hunted. They never camped together again. They avoided the mountains entirely. Sometimes, late at night, Jenna would wake to the sensation of eyes on her, the memory of red glows and elongated limbs haunting her dreams. Chris heard the whispers in his sleep. Mike sometimes felt phantom footsteps circling his bed. Lila refused to go into the woods, ever. They never spoke about it much, and when asked, they would laugh it off. But all of them knew the truth. Something was out there in the Appalachian woods, something ancient, something patient, and something that had followed them out, waiting for the next time the darkness fell. And every time one of them drove past a stretch of remote forest, their hearts would tighten. Because the feeling never went away, that subtle, suffocating certainty that they were never truly alone, and that the woods had marked them forever. Story the end. It was a crisp September morning when Jake, Lisa, Mark, and I piled into Mark's old Jeep, packed to the brim with tents, backpacks, and enough food to last a week. We were heading to Pine Hollow, a remote patch of woods in northern Vermont that promised seclusion and adventure. We had been planning this trip for months, a last-minute getaway before college started again, and none of us had any doubts that it would be the perfect escape. The drive was long, winding through narrow, tree-lined roads, the kind where sunlight barely pierced the canopy. By the time we turned onto the gravel path leading to the trailhead, the sky had taken on that late-afternoon golden glow. Parking the Jeep, we unloaded the gear, stretching our stiff legs and breathing in the scent of pine and wet earth. It was quiet. Too quiet, almost. But we brushed it off as being out in the middle of nowhere. The hike to our chosen campsite took longer than expected. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick, and fallen logs littered the narrow trail. We joked about getting lost, but I could feel the tension in the air even as I laughed. Mark, ever the outdoorsman, led the way with a map in one hand and a compass in the other. Lisa and Jake bickered playfully behind me, but there was a subtle unease in the way they kept glancing around, as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. Flat ground for tents, water nearby, and enough open space to build a fire. As we set up camp, the wind whispered through the branches above, carrying with it an unsettling rustle that didn't match the movement of the leaves. I shook it off as nerves and focused on unpacking. Night fell fast in the forest. We gathered around the fire, the flames throwing long, jagged shadows across the trees. The usual campfire stories were half-hearted tonight, the usual laughter subdued. Jake mentioned he thought he saw a figure watching us from deeper in the woods, but when we all looked, there was nothing. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light. Sometime around midnight, the first real scare happened. Lisa woke us, shaking, saying she thought someone or something was outside our tents. We grabbed flashlights and poked our heads out, sweeping the beams across the dark forest. Nothing, no footprints, no shapes. Only the distant howl of a coyote, which Mark insisted was nothing more than wildlife. But when we returned to our tents, we found small, muddy footprints circling our campsite. Not human footprints. They were too small, too oddly shaped, almost like animal tracks, but more upright, almost humanoid. The next day, we debated leaving, but none of us wanted to admit fear had gotten the better of us. We convinced ourselves it had been some local hikers or animals. We spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, trying to enjoy the scenery, though the feeling of being watched never left me. The shadows seemed longer, the rustling behind us more deliberate. When we stopped to rest, I swore I could hear faint whispering on the wind, though no one else admitted to hearing it. By nightfall, the unease escalated. Our fire refused to stay lit. No matter how much wood we added, the flames sputtered and died, as if something in the forest was smothering it. We huddled together in the largest tent, flashlights casting frantic beams across the canvas walls. That's when the noises started. Scraping, low growls, something heavy moving just beyond the tent. Mark tried to rationalize it as bears or raccoons, but the sounds were different. They were deliberate. They circled the tent, paused, then started again, closer this time. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible at first, then sharper, almost mocking. Lisa started crying, and Jake muttered that he wanted to leave, but every time we tried to step out, the shadows seemed to push back, closing in. Around 3 a.m., the tent shuddered violently. Something was trying to get in. The zipper rattled under pressure, and I swear I saw a shadow pressing against the thin fabric. Panicked, we grabbed sticks and the only machete Mark had brought. We shouted, banged on the tent, anything to scare it off. The noises stopped suddenly, leaving only the pounding of our own hearts and the suffocating silence of the forest. We didn't sleep after that. At first light, we packed frantically, eager to leave. That's when we noticed the trail. The path we had taken the previous day had changed. Trees were bent in unnatural ways, roots twisted across our intended route. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, trying to trap us. Hours passed. Every attempt to find the jeep or retrace our steps led us deeper into the woods. We stumbled upon strange markers, small piles of stones in odd formations, sticks sharpened to points stuck into the ground. The whispering returned, following us, sometimes from above, sometimes behind, never fully in view. Jake started hallucinating, pointing at figures in the trees that disappeared when we turned. By late afternoon, hunger and exhaustion were setting in. Mark suggested we climb a ridge he thought he recognized. As we scrambled up the slope, Lisa tripped over something half buried in the soil. It was a decayed campsite, old and abandoned, with charred fire remains and torn tents. But what made our blood run cold were the drawings on the surrounding trees. Symbols scratched deep into the bark, some resembling eyes, others humanoid shapes with elongated limbs. Night fell again, faster than before. We tried to find shelter, any kind of protection, but the forest offered none. The whispering grew louder, now clearly words, but not in English. The shapes we glimpsed between trees became more defined. Tall, emaciated figures moving unnaturally, sometimes crouched, sometimes running with impossible speed. We ran. It's the only word that fits what we did. For hours through underbrush and over streams, until exhaustion left us crawling on hands and knees. Somewhere along the way, we lost Mark. One moment he was next to us, the next he was gone. We screamed, called, retraced steps, but there was only silence, then a distant laugh, high-pitched and mocking, echoing through the trees. By dawn, we found a small clearing and collapsed. That's when I saw the footprints again, circling us, closer this time. I followed them with my flashlight, heart sinking. They led to a cluster of trees where the bark was scraped off in vertical lines as if something had climbed them. And at the base of one, I saw Mark's hat. Not his backpack, not his jacket, just the hat. We didn't stop to investigate. We kept moving, crawling, limping, any direction that seemed away from those trees. By midday, we stumbled upon a service road, dirt and gravel, overgrown but still clear. We followed it until finally, impossibly, the Jeep appeared. No one spoke as we jumped in, started the engine, and drove straight to the nearest town. Authorities were called for a search, but they never found Mark. They found no evidence of anyone else in the woods, no signs of struggle. Just footprints that ended abruptly, deep in the forest, and the strange tree markings. Lisa refuses to go camping again. Jake swears he'll never enter a forest at night. Me, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those long-limbed figures, hear the whispering, feel the forest shifting, and I know if you wander too deep, it doesn't just swallow you. It toys with you, it follows, and sometimes it takes. Story the end. The forest had this unnatural silence when we first arrived. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound like a drum in a cavern. My friends and I, Jake, Marissa, and Tyler, were eager for a weekend getaway, thinking we could escape the chaos of the city by camping deep in the Appalachian woods. We had maps, flashlights, enough food to last the weekend, and all the optimism of people who had never really been in the woods alone at night. We set up camp just before dusk near a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The sun was fading behind the dense canopy, turning the sky into a bruised purple. Jake, as usual, was in charge of the fire, trying to light it with damp kindling while Marissa unpacked the cooler. Tyler wandered off a little ways, claiming he wanted to explore. I stayed near the tents, double-checking our supplies. As the first stars began to appear, the fire sputtered to life. The warmth and light made the clearing feel safer, but that quiet, it was still there, like a living thing crouched just beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Marissa whispered, freezing mid-step as she stacked logs. "Hear what?" Jake asked, though he glanced nervously into the shadows. "It sounded like footsteps," she said, "but there's no one else out here." I shook my head. "Probably just Tyler," I said, trying to sound confident. "He's wandering somewhere." We called for him, but there was only the echo of our own voices bouncing back at us. I started to feel it then, that creeping tension that tells you something is off, though you can't quite name it. By nightfall, Tyler still hadn't returned. We left the fire burning, grabbed our flashlights, and started calling his name. The woods swallowed our voices almost instantly, the trees and underbrush turning every shout into a faint, twisted echo. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from deeper in the woods. "Tyler?" I called again, my voice shakier now. The growl answered with a rustle, like something big was moving fast through the brush. Jake grabbed a branch, holding it like a weapon. "We need to stay together," he said. "Don't go chasing him." Marissa and I nodded, sticking close to him. We circled the camp, like shining our flashlights into every dark corner. At first, we thought it might be a bear, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't random or natural. It was deliberate, almost like it was tracking us, moving around the edges of the clearing, staying just out of sight. Then we saw the first sign. Tyler's flashlight lying on the ground near the stream, shattered, the glass glittering like tiny stars in the firelight. I felt my stomach twist. "Tyler," Marissa said softly, but she was shaking now. We followed the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth for what felt like hours, calling his name until our throats were raw. And then we saw the marks on the trees. Deep scratches, clawed into the bark, some with small streaks of dark red that looked disturbingly like blood. "Okay, that's not a bear," Jake muttered, voice tight. "That's something else." By now, the forest felt alive around us. Shadows stretched and twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The wind whispered through the branches in eerie patterns, and every snap of a twig made us jump. We didn't know if Tyler was alive, or if whatever was out there had already gotten to him. We heard the growl again, closer this time, and saw movement. A figure, or maybe more than one, darted between the trees, too fast to be human, too upright to be any normal animal. "Run," I said, and we sprinted back toward the camp, hearts hammering, lungs burning. But when we got there, it wasn't our tents waiting for us. The fire had died completely. Everything was silent except for the occasional snapping of twigs somewhere nearby. And then we saw them, eyes reflecting our flashlight beams, dozens of them, all watching from the darkness. We froze. Not because we wanted to, but because our bodies couldn't react fast enough. The creatures were tall, too tall, with elongated limbs that bent wrong and heads that seemed almost too big for their bodies. They didn't make a sound, but we felt the threat in their gaze, a predator's patience. One of them stepped forward, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. That's when we realized the footsteps we'd been hearing weren't Tyler. They weren't human at all. The air thickened and a smell hit us, wet, metallic, like old blood and rusted metal. Jake screamed and swung his branch, but it passed harmlessly through the creature, as though it were insubstantial for a moment. Then it lunged, faster than any animal should be able to move. We scattered. I tripped over a root, scraping my knees, and that's when I felt it, something cold and wet brushing my arm. I scrambled upright and ran blindly, branches whipping against my face, tripping, falling, getting up again. We regrouped near the stream, backs against a fallen log, trying to catch our breath. But the sound of movement was all around us now. Rustling, growling, the occasional sharp crack that made us flinch, thinking it was the end. "Tyler," Marissa whispered again, tears streaming down her face. And then we saw him, or what was left of him. His legs were twisted in ways they shouldn't be, blood matted into his hair, his eyes wide open in terror. It was like whatever attacked him had drained all humanity from his expression, frozen it in fear. I gagged. Jake cursed under his breath, pounding his fists against the log, as though we could bring Tyler back by sheer force. Marissa screamed, collapsing against me. The creatures watched us, silent now, moving just at the edge of the darkness. And then, inexplicably, they retreated. We didn't question it. We ran. Straight into the woods, away from the clearing, away from whatever that had been stalking us. We didn't stop until the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, until the forest's oppressive darkness was replaced by the soft light of morning. But the relief was hollow. There was no way back to the road from here, no cell signal, nothing but miles of unbroken forest and the memories of what we'd seen. By mid-morning, we stumbled across a small ranger station. It looked abandoned, but the phone worked. When we called for help, the operator's voice was calm, almost too calm, asking for our location. I gave it as best I could, but I could hear in their voice that they knew the forest better than we ever would. They promised someone would come, that we were safe now. When the rangers arrived, they found the campsite. No bodies, no evidence of creatures, only the broken flashlight and the scratches on the trees. They asked questions, took notes, but there was that same calmness in their eyes, like they'd seen it before. Like it was routine. We never went back. We never spoke about it much afterward, not in detail. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still see the way they moved. Too fast, too silent, watching, patient, like predators that wait for the perfect moment to strike. And I remember Tyler's eyes wide and frozen in fear, and the forest around us that felt alive, almost sentient, as though it had been waiting for us all along. People ask if we saw something paranormal or just some rare predator. I don't answer. I know what I saw. And some nights, I swear I can still hear those footsteps circling, waiting, reminding me that the forest never forgets, and it never forgives. Story the end. The sun was already dipping below the trees as Jake, Megan, and their friends, Tyler and Lisa, pulled into the small gravel parking area at Cedar Ridge Campground. The place was tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, the kind of forest that looked picturesque in a brochure but felt claustrophobic in person. The air was heavy with pine and damp soil, the scent thick enough to cling to their clothes and hair. They were all excited to escape the city, craving a weekend away from traffic, Wi-Fi, and responsibility. They laughed and argued over who would carry what gear as they unloaded their backpacks, tents, and camping supplies. The campground itself was mostly empty. A few tents dotted the larger loops, and a lone RV sputtered in the distance. It was quiet, too quiet, Jake thought. Even the birds were sparse, their occasional calls sharp and distant. The rangers had warned them about wildlife and to keep their food stored in the bear lockers, but Jake didn't mind. He'd camped before. He wasn't worried. Megan, however, kept scanning the tree line with a subtle unease, tugging at her jacket whenever a branch cracked in the wind. They set up camp near a small clearing that opened onto a creek. By the time they had the tent pitched, it was dark, and the forest had taken on an almost oppressive density. They built a fire and roasted hot dogs, letting the smoke drift lazily up through the canopy. Tyler pulled out a guitar and strummed a few songs, while Lisa and Megan shared a thermos of hot chocolate. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. But as the firelight flickered over the trees, Jake thought he heard something, just at the edge of the clearing. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across dirt. He froze and glanced at the others, but they were all absorbed in their own conversation, laughing at a poorly timed joke. Jake shook his head and muttered, "Probably just a branch." He told himself he wasn't scared, though his pulse quickened. Night settled in fully, thick and velvety, swallowing the clearing and turning the forest into a shadowed maze. They crawled into the tent after a while, the warmth of the sleeping bags a small comfort against the cool fall air. They had just drifted off when Tyler stirred, his voice a whisper. "Did anyone else hear that?" "What?" Jake mumbled, eyes half closed. "That dragging sound, outside." Megan shivered. "Maybe it's a deer?" Tyler shook his head. "I don't know. It didn't sound right. It was too heavy, like someone walking." Jake reluctantly unzipped the tent, peering into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, barely illuminating the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a movement. A shadow flickered between the trees, just on the edge of the clearing. He blinked. It was gone. "Guys, there's something out there," he said, voice low. Lisa laughed nervously. "You're just imagining things." But the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate, dragging footstep against the forest floor. Not light like a deer, not scuttling like a raccoon. Deliberate and heavy. They huddled together, the warmth of fear sharper than the chill. Jake grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining it toward the sound. The beam caught nothing at first. Then a figure, a man, or something resembling a man, emerged from the shadows. His clothes were tattered, skin gray and streaked with dirt, eyes reflecting the flashlight with a strange wet sheen. He didn't speak, didn't move quickly, just stood there, watching. "Holy shit!" Tyler whispered, frozen. Megan tried to close the tent. "Jake, do something!" Jake's fingers fumbled with the flashlight and a heavy stick he'd grabbed. The figure took a step forward, slow and deliberate. Then another, and another. The forest seemed to stretch with every step he took. Their fire was out. The clearing swallowed them whole. And then he ran. It wasn't a normal run. It was all wrong, awkward, jerking, like his limbs didn't obey him. He stopped at the tree line, head turning unnaturally to follow them as they scrambled out of the tent, hearts hammering. They ran blindly, tripping over roots and rocks until they reached the edge of the creek. "What the hell was that?" Lisa panted, clutching Megan's arm. "I don't know," Jake said. His mind was racing, trying to rationalize what they had just seen. "Maybe a homeless guy?" "No one lives out here," Megan said firmly. Her voice trembled. "Not like him." They decided to leave the clearing, hiking along the creek to put distance between themselves and the figure. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no rustling animals, just the sound of their own labored breathing and the distant rush of water. Then they heard it again. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere ahead of them. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something in between, a sound that rattled their bones. They froze, scanning the dark trees. The growl came again, followed by a dragging step. They were being followed. Panic surged, and they ran, slipping on wet leaves, the forest closing in like a living thing. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into an abandoned campsite, one that wasn't on the map. Tattered tents sagged like corpses, and rusted cans and broken lanterns littered the ground. The air was thick with decay. This place is wrong," Tyler whispered. They had no choice but to keep moving. But the forest seemed endless, twisting and looping back on itself. Every turn led them deeper into darkness, and the sounds of pursuit never stopped. Footsteps, dragging, growling, echoing unnaturally. Jake began to feel like the forest itself was alive, shifting to trap them. Finally, they stumbled onto an old logging road. Exhausted, they ran down it, hoping it would lead to civilization. The road ended abruptly at a creek, swollen from recent rain. There was no bridge, no path forward. And then they saw him again, the figure from the clearing, standing on the far bank, watching. But this time he wasn't alone. Others emerged from the trees, moving with the same jerky gait. Dozens of them, silent, waiting. Their eyes glinted in the dim light. Jake felt a wave of nausea and terror so intense it rooted him to the spot. Megan grabbed his arm, shaking. "We have to climb the bank. We have to get out." They scrambled up the muddy slope, slipping and pulling each other along. Behind them, the figures didn't run. They didn't chase. They just watched, and their growls started to form into something else, a chorus of low, harsh whispers that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Hours must have passed. They stumbled upon a small ranger cabin, boarded up and decaying. They broke a window, climbed inside, and barricaded themselves with whatever they could find. Through the cracks, they could see the figures milling in the clearing outside, their heads tilting unnaturally, the whispers growing louder. Dawn arrived finally, though it brought little comfort. The figures had vanished. No footprints, no traces. Nothing. It was like they had never been there. Shaken and exhausted, the group hiked back to the main trail, finding their way to a ranger station by mid-morning. They told their story, but the rangers looked at them with a mix of pity and disbelief. "Cedar Ridge isn't haunted," one ranger said cautiously. "Nothing like what you're describing has ever been reported." Jake, Megan, Tyler, and Lisa didn't argue. They just packed up and left, driving in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest loomed behind them through the rearview mirror, deceptively calm under the morning sun. Weeks later, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the whispers, the dragging footsteps, the pale figures with jerking movements and wet, reflective eyes. He stayed up nights listening for any unusual sounds, checking the shadows in his apartment, terrified that something had followed them home. Megan avoided the forest entirely. Tyler had nightmares, waking screaming at random hours. Lisa refused to camp again, her once easy laughter replaced with a quiet, haunted look. They never saw the figures again, but the memory didn't fade. And sometimes in the quiet of night, Jake swore he could still hear that low, dragging sound just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting. Story the end. The first night in the woods started like any other camping trip for Jake, Emily, and their friends. They had driven hours from the city to a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where cell service was spotty at best and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the sun dipped behind the dense canopy just as they pitched their tents near a small creek. It was late September, and the nights were already cold, but the group was full of energy. They laughed and joked around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories that weren't nearly as scary as they liked to pretend. Emily, the practical one of the group, had insisted on a perimeter check before they settled down for the night. The woods felt unusually quiet as they walked along the edge of their campsite, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Everything seemed normal, the usual rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. She mentioned it to Jake, who shrugged it off and said it was probably just the wind. Still, the unease lingered. Around midnight, the first signs that something was wrong began to appear. Jake had woken up to the sound of someone whispering his name. At first, he thought it was Emily, but when he unzipped the tent, the camp was empty. The fire had died down to embers, and a thin fog had settled along the creek. He called out for his friends, but only the echo of his own voice returned. Emily's flashlight beam swept over the tents, and she noticed something that made her stomach twist. A set of footprints circling their campsite, coming from the woods and back again. They were too large to be human, and the spacing was wrong, uneven, as if the creature was walking on all fours at times and on two legs at others. Panic set in slowly. Jake woke the others, Mark and Lauren, and they all tried to convince themselves it was just an animal. But the sense of being watched didn't fade. It intensified. They debated packing up and leaving immediately, but the fog had thickened and they couldn't even see the path back to their car. Emily suggested staying put and keeping the fire going, reasoning that if they stayed together, they might be safe. It was a fragile comfort. Hours passed. Every few minutes, the sound of snapping branches or the low growl of something moving just beyond the light of the fire would jolt them awake. At one point, Mark swore he saw a figure, tall, hunched, moving between the trees. It didn't run, didn't hide, it simply watched. When they flicked their flashlights in its direction, it disappeared. The group began to argue quietly, tension mounting, fear unraveling their nerves. Lauren, usually the most composed, was trembling uncontrollably, convinced that whatever it was wouldn't leave them alone until it had them. By dawn, exhaustion had set in. They decided to make a run for the car, hoping daylight would give them an advantage. As they packed their gear, Emily noticed something even more disturbing. The footprints weren't just outside. They were inside the perimeter of the tents as well, and some seemed to cross through the sleeping bags themselves. No one could explain it. None of them had left the tent during the night. Their fear deepened, and the sense of urgency turned into terror. The hike back to the trailhead was slow. Every few steps they felt eyes on them, heard branches cracking in sync with their own footsteps. Jake tried to keep them calm, saying it was probably a bear, but the footprints weren't bear prints, and the creature's movements were deliberate, intelligent, stalking. They stopped at a ridge to catch their breath, and from there they could see the tops of their cars parked near the entrance. Relief was fleeting. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees below them, slower this time, deliberately following. Lauren screamed, and the figure vanished into the woods, leaving only the sound of leaves rustling. When they reached their car, the terror didn't end. The doors were unlocked, the engine gone, and a smear of muddy footprints led away from the vehicles. Jake tried the phone. No signal. Panic turned into cold calculation. They decided they had to move on foot to the nearest ranger station, nearly 5 miles away. They knew it was risky, but staying put meant certain confrontation. As they walked, the woods seemed to close in around them. Every turn they took led them into eerily familiar terrain, as if the forest itself was shifting. The whispering began again, low and guttural, repeating their names in a distorted cadence. Emily's flashlight illuminated something in the trees, a crude figure, roughly human in shape but grotesque, made of twigs, leaves, and mud. Its face, if it could be called that, was a hollow void. Mark froze, unable to move, and the creature's head tilted slowly, almost curiously. Then it was gone. By late afternoon, the forest had turned oppressive. Their path to the ranger station was blocked by fallen trees and thick underbrush, and the sky overhead was turning a dark, bruised gray. Emily suggested they climb a ridge to get a better view, hoping to spot some sign of civilization. The climb was steep and treacherous. When they reached the top, what they saw made them realize they were no longer near where they thought they were. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, as if it had swallowed the trail entirely. As night fell again, desperation set in. They tried to make camp, but the sense of being hunted was unbearable. Something followed them, staying just out of reach, never making direct contact but always present. Lauren screamed again when the fire flickered and shadows danced unnaturally, forming shapes that looked like dozens of human figures standing silently around them. The group huddled together, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. Around midnight, Emily thought she saw movement directly behind Jake, a hand, pale and elongated, brushing against his shoulder. He spun around, but nothing was there. The fog rolled in, thick and clinging, muffling sound and warping distance. They were trapped in a world that no longer obeyed the rules of reality. Trees seemed to bend toward them, shadows lunged forward at impossible angles, and the whispering grew into a chorus, chanting in a language none of them knew. By morning, they stumbled upon an abandoned campsite, remnants of a fire long cold, a torn tent, and strange carvings etched into the surrounding trees. The carvings depicted figures similar to the ones they had seen, tall, twisted, faceless. They realized with horror that this wasn't the first group the woods had claimed. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth, and Emily noticed faint, dried bloodstains on the leaves. They didn't linger. Their final attempt at escape led them to a creek that appeared to flow in the wrong direction. Exhaustion had them walking in circles. Emily screamed when she spotted a figure across the creek. A person? No, too distorted, too large, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It watched them silently, then slowly receded into the mist, always just beyond reach. Mark and Lauren were crying openly. Jake tried to keep control, but even he could feel the panic settling deep in his chest, freezing him. It took until the next day for them to finally break out of the forest, following instinct rather than trail. They emerged miles from their starting point, exhausted, dirty, and forever changed. When they returned to civilization, no one believed them. Rangers found nothing, no traces of the footprints, no torn tents, no evidence of the campsite they had described. The only proof was the terror etched into their faces, the stories they told of whispering shadows and impossible figures. Jake, Emily, Mark, and Lauren never went camping again. They avoided the woods entirely, but the nightmares persisted. Emily swore she could hear whispering when she closed her eyes at night. Jake occasionally glimpsed movement at the edge of his vision, shadows that shouldn't exist. Mark started carrying a small knife everywhere he went, and Lauren never slept without a light on. No one ever found out exactly what was in those Appalachian woods that night. The footprints, the figures, the whispering, all vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. But each of them knew the truth. Something had followed them, studied them, and could easily follow again if they ever returned. The forest had teeth, and it was patient. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, they swear they can hear it calling, whispering their names, reminding them that the woods never forget. Story the end. The rain had stopped only an hour before we reached the trailhead, leaving the ground slick and the air thick with the smell of wet pine. My brother Eric insisted the storm made everything better. "More atmosphere," he said, grinning as he adjusted the straps on his pack. His friend Denise rolled her eyes but smiled anyway. I was the only one who felt uneasy before we even stepped into the trees. We were heading to a place called Braylock Woods, a stretch of forest in northern Pennsylvania that most locals refused to talk about. Eric had found it on some obscure camping forum where people bragged about going to the creepiest places nature had to offer. I didn't want to come, but Eric practically begged. "Last adventure before I move," he said. So, against my better judgment, I went. The trail was narrow and overgrown, twisting between towering pines. The storm had knocked down branches, and the path was almost erased in places. We walked for nearly an hour before finding a clearing big enough for our tent. It was oddly shaped, long rather than wide, like something had been dragged through it repeatedly. When I pointed that out, Eric laughed and said it was just runoff from the rain, but even he didn't sound convinced. We pitched the tent, boiled some water for instant noodles, and tried to warm ourselves by a small fire. But the woods were wrong. Too quiet. Even after the storm, I expected birds, maybe crickets, but there was nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Once night fell, the darkness felt thicker than it should have been, as if the trees themselves absorbed the firelight. Around 10 p.m., we heard the first sound. A crack. Sharp. Too deliberate to be the wind or a branch falling. Eric stood up, shining his flashlight into the woods. The beam stretched only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness. "Probably just a deer," he said, though I saw his jaw tighten. Denise scooted closer to the fire, rubbing her arms. "Why does it feel like it's getting colder?" I felt it too, as if a cold front had moved in around us specifically. The fire crackled, but its warmth barely reached. We tried to shake it off and went to bed. Denise and I shared one side of the tent while Eric took the other. I must have dozed off for maybe half an hour when a sound yanked me awake. A low, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across bark. I held my breath, listening. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside the tent. I nudged Denise. "You hear that?" Her eyes opened immediately. "Yes," she whispered. We didn't wake Eric at first, maybe because we didn't want to believe it was real. Then something thumped against the side of the tent hard enough to make the fabric ripple inward. Denise let out a small cry. That woke Eric. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice tight. The scraping returned, circling us. Slow, deliberate, too slow to be any animal I knew of. Eric unzipped the tent an inch and peeked out with his flashlight. "I don't see." He didn't finish the sentence. He dropped the flashlight. I grabbed it instinctively. "What did you see?" But he just shook his head, scrambling backward as if terrified the thing outside could hear us. We stayed frozen for a long time, listening. Finally, the scraping faded. Then silence swallowed everything again. We didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, we hesitantly stepped outside. The ground around the tent was disturbed, deep, heavy footprints in the mud, but not shaped like boots, paws, or hooves. They were elongated, almost skeletal, and some were so close to the tent that they overlapped the edge. Denise wanted to leave immediately. I did too, but Eric insisted we stay until sundown and then hike back in the cooler evening. "We'll cover more ground," he said. I knew he was just trying to pretend nothing strange had happened, but arguing with him never worked. So we stayed. We explored the woods around the campsite in the morning light. We found claw marks on several trees, long, vertical slashes far too high up for any animal I could think of. Worse, some trees had what looked like handprints smeared into the bark, thin, bony, and wrong in proportions. Denise refused to look after the first one. Around noon, we discovered something else. A little clearing deeper in the woods, perfectly circular. Everything inside it, grass, bushes, even dead leaves, was flattened, pressed into the ground as though something enormous had lain there. In the center was a pile of stones arranged into a rough triangle. Eric crouched to inspect it. "Looks like some kind of marker." "It looks like a grave," Denise said. She was closer to the truth than she knew. We went back to the campsite in silence. I kept feeling eyes on the back of my neck. Every twig snap made me spin around, and each time there was nothing. By afternoon, the atmosphere grew heavier. Denise kept complaining her chest hurt. Eric seemed on edge, but tried not to show it. I decided to collect more firewood before sundown. The others stayed behind. I wasn't gone long before I heard it again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. This time it was above me. I looked up and froze. Something was perched on a branch about 20 feet overhead. I only saw it for a second, barely illuminated by a shard of sun slipping through the clouds. Its limbs were too long, too thin, hanging from the branch like a grotesque marionette. Its head was wrong, tilted far to the side as if bones had snapped long ago and never healed. Hollow eye sockets stared down at me. It didn't move, but its jaw slowly opened, far wider than a human jaw should. I dropped the wood and ran. When I burst back into camp, gasping, Eric and Denise jumped up. "It's in the trees," I choked out. "We need to leave. Now." Eric finally stopped pretending everything was fine. We tore the tent down in minutes, stuffing it into our packs haphazardly. The sun was dipping behind clouds, shadows sliding through the woods like ink. We started down the trail, but the woods didn't feel like the same woods we'd entered. The path was narrower, darker, and soon the scraping returned, this time flanking us on both sides. We walked faster. Then we heard a whisper, just one word, but I felt it in my bones. "Stay," Denise screamed. We broke into a run. Branches whipped at our faces, mud splashed underfoot, and somewhere behind us, something moved swiftly, silently, except for the occasional low clicking sound, like bones tapping together. Eric tripped first. I grabbed his arm before he fell completely, but the moment he hit the ground, the forest erupted. A tall, skeletal figure dropped from the trees, landing only a few feet from him with a wet, cracking thud. It rose to its full height, at least 7 feet, and its limbs twitched unnaturally as if it was still learning how to use them. Its jaw hung open, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. Black fluid dripped from its fingertips. Denise froze. Eric stared in shock. I pulled them both. "Run!" We bolted, crashing through the woods. The creature pursued, moving in bursts, first silent, then suddenly appearing closer than it should have been. Every time I looked back, it was gliding unnaturally between trees, bending in ways no living thing could bend. We didn't stop until we saw the glint of the trailhead sign through the trees. But the moment we reached it, Denise screamed again. Another one of the creatures was standing near the sign, waiting. There were 2, maybe more. We darted to the left, abandoning the trail completely. The ground sloped downward, and we half ran, half slid until we reached the bottom of a ravine. A fallen log formed a natural barricade. We crouched behind it, trying to stay quiet. Minutes dragged by. Then we heard footsteps above us. Slow, searching. Eric's breathing turned ragged. Denise was crying softly. The footsteps paused. I thought that was the end. I thought it had found us. But then they moved away, fading. We waited until nearly dawn before crawling out of the ravine, trembling and soaked in mud. The woods looked normal again, almost peaceful. But none of us felt safe until we reached the car, practically diving inside and speeding down the road. We didn't talk about what we saw. Not that day, not later. Eric moved 2 weeks after that trip. Denise stopped returning my calls. I can't blame her. Some things you never want to recall. But here's the part I don't tell them. 2 nights ago, I heard scraping outside my bedroom window. Slow. Deliberate, like nails across wood. And when I looked the next morning, there were marks, long, thin, and arranged in a triangle. The same shape we saw in the clearing. I don't think we left Braylock Woods behind. I think something from those woods followed us out. And it's waiting. Story the end. The weekend was supposed to be simple. Just me, my cousin Ethan, and our two friends, Claire and Marcus, escaping the city for some real camping in the Allegheny National Forest. None of us were seasoned campers. In fact, this was the first time any of us had gone this deep into the woods without a guide. We laughed about it in the car as we drove north, joking that we'd probably be eaten alive by raccoons or have a bear stroll into our campsite. But nothing could have prepared us for what actually happened. We arrived late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees, casting the forest in long, twisted shadows. Our campsite was off a dirt road hidden in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. There was a rusty old sign partially buried in underbrush that read, "Campground closed," but we ignored it, thinking no one would see us there anyway. The site had a fire ring and a small creek nearby, but the rest was pure wilderness. As we unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake a feeling that we weren't alone. The wind was quiet, the leaves almost still, and there was a strange smell in the air, like wet soil mixed with something metallic. After setting up the tents, we built a fire and started cooking hot dogs. The woods around us were silent except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash from the creek. Marcus, ever the thrill seeker, suggested we tell ghost stories. We joked at first, but soon the stories felt heavier, darker, almost too believable. Then, in the middle of a story about a hiker who vanished in the forest decades ago, Claire froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. At first, we thought it was the creek, or maybe a branch falling, but then we heard it again. Faint footsteps crunching through the leaves, circling our camp. Not slow like an animal, but deliberate, heavy, almost rhythmic. The sound stopped abruptly when Ethan flicked his flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing. We tried to ignore it, laughing nervously, but the footsteps continued intermittently through the night. Around 1 a.m., I woke to Claire shaking me. "Something's outside," she said, eyes wide. I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught movement, a figure crouched behind a tree. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe a prankster from another campsite, but its shape was wrong, elongated, almost skeletal. It didn't run when it saw us, it just stared, and then it vanished, melting into the shadows like smoke. We didn't sleep much after that. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made us jump. By dawn, the forest felt different, more oppressive. We decided to explore a trail that led deeper into the woods, hoping to distract ourselves. It was overgrown and narrow, and the further we went, the darker the forest became, even in the morning light. Then Marcus stopped abruptly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground. The dirt was marked with footprints, huge, wider than any human foot, and uneven, like it wasn't made to walk on two legs. The prints led away from the trail and into the thicker part of the forest. We all felt a chill, but curiosity got the better of us. We followed, the hum of the forest growing heavier, almost vibrating in our ears. It was Claire who saw it first. A shadow moving between the trees. Not a deer, not a bear, but something humanoid. It was thin, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that bent at odd angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It moved silently, effortlessly, but always just at the edge of our vision. We ran. The forest turned into a nightmare as roots and branches clawed at our clothes and faces. The thing followed, always close enough that we could hear its breathing, or what we thought was its breathing, and feel its presence behind us. Marcus stumbled and fell, scraping his hands and knees, but somehow we all got back to the clearing. The fire had burned down to embers, and when we looked back toward the tree line, the thing was gone. Completely gone. But we didn't feel safe. We packed our tents and gear in a panic, throwing everything into the car as fast as possible. The drive back to the highway was silent, except for Claire's quiet sobbing in the back seat. When cell service returned, none of us spoke for miles. Years later, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hallucination, maybe stress, maybe a trick of the shadows. But none of us have ever returned to that forest. And every now and then, late at night, I swear I can still hear the slow, deliberate steps of something moving just beyond the tree line, waiting. Story, the end. The gravel road leading into Blackwater Ridge cracked beneath my tires as I drove deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. It was early October, cold enough that my breath fogged lightly when I stepped outside, but not yet winter. I'd come alone, which even I had to admit was a stupid choice. But after months of nonstop work and stress, solitude sounded like the only cure. Everyone I told said the same thing. Don't camp at Blackwater. Locals said the woods were wrong somehow. Too quiet, too empty, too easy to get lost in. I laughed it off. Urban legends, superstition, paranoia. I wasn't a kid anymore. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. Not a single other car in the entire lot. I should have taken that as the first sign something wasn't right. Instead, I shrugged, strapped my pack on, and headed in. My plan was simple. Hike in 5 miles, set camp near the creek, spend the night, and come back out the next afternoon. Blackwater Ridge was beautiful at first glance. Dense pines, golden leaves carpeting the forest floor, sunlight streaming weakly through the canopy. But beneath the beauty was a strange stillness. No birds, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. With every step deeper into the woods, I felt like I was entering a sealed-off world where sound didn't travel correctly. After 2 hours of hiking, I found a clearing beside the creek, just large enough for my tent. The water was shallow, moving sluggishly over rocks slick with moss. The forest on the opposite bank was thicker, darker, the trees packed tightly as if huddling together. I pitched my tent, gathered wood, and got a small fire going. The warmth helped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing toward the tree line. Nothing moved there, but the shadows felt too deep, too intentional. It reminded me of walking into a room just after someone leaves, like the air held the memory of a presence. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. I sat by the fire, cooking a can of chili, listening to the crackling wood. When darkness fully settled in, I realized that the forest had become silent. Completely silent. Not a single sound except the pop of sap in the fire. Around 10 p.m. I heard it. A splash from the creek. Not small, like a fish or stone, something heavy stepping into the water. My body stiffened instantly. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the bank. Nothing. Just water rippling slowly back into stillness. I tried to calm myself. Elk, maybe? Or a deer. But then I heard another sound. Low, guttural breathing. Not the quick, delicate snorts of a deer or the heavy huff of a bear. This was slow, deliberate, like someone exhaling inches from your ear. The fire sputtered as the wind suddenly picked up, cold enough to sting. I backed toward my tent, scanning the darkness. The breathing continued, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. I stayed by the fire until after midnight. When the breathing finally stopped, I managed to convince myself it must have been an animal, no matter how wrong it sounded. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into my tent. I fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last. At 2:13 a.m., I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling my tent. Not soft, animal-like padding, human footsteps, slow, crunching across the leaf litter. I held my breath, terrified it would hear even that. The steps made a complete circle around me, paused at the tent's front zipper, then continued again. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. After what felt like an hour, but was probably minutes, the footsteps faded, and then came the scratching. Soft at first, like fingers tracing the fabric of my tent, then harder, more frantic, like something was trying to find a weak point. I stayed perfectly still. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence, thick and suffocating, settled again, and then a whisper, so close it vibrated through the nylon. "I saw you." I nearly screamed but clamped my hand over my mouth. A faint rustling followed, then heavy, dragging footsteps moving away into the forest. I lay awake until dawn, paralyzed by fear. When the first light hit, I crawled out of my tent, half expecting to find nothing. But the ground told a different story. Footprints, bare footprints, surrounded the tent. Dozens of them. Some looked normal. Others were long, twisted, as if the bones inside had been rearranged. The strangest part, they led from the creek, then vanished only a few feet into the woods, just disappeared into nothing. I should have left immediately, but stupidly, stubbornly, I needed to see if someone had messed with me. Maybe a local, maybe another camper messing around. So I followed the trail toward the creek. That's when I saw the first scrap of fabric caught on a branch, shredded, weathered by age. It looked like a torn piece of a shirt. Then, another, and another. By the time I reached the creek, I'd found a half-dozen scraps. Across the water, something glinted from beneath a pile of dead leaves. I climbed over, heart hammering. When I brushed the leaves aside, I froze. A camping backpack, old, faded, covered in dirt and mold, the kind that had been sitting in the woods for years. Inside were items that made my skin crawl: a cracked flashlight, a map from 1997, a rusted hunting knife, and a journal damaged badly by moisture. I flipped through what I could read. Most of it was ruined, but a few lines remained clear. There's something in these woods. It follows at night. It pretends to be human. Do not look at its face. Do not answer if it speaks your name. The last page had a single line, carved deep as if pressed with a knife. It knows you're here. A twig snapped behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Slow footsteps approached, each one slow and deliberate. My body locked up. The air around me grew colder, thick like breathing through ice. Then it spoke. Not a whisper this time, a voice. Raspy, uneven, like someone trying to imitate speech after not using their vocal cords for years. You came back. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. Something touched my shoulder, long, cold fingers that pressed with unnatural strength. My survival instincts kicked in hard. I bolted, nearly slipping on the moss-covered stones, sprinting blindly through the trees. Branches whipped my face. The forest blurred into streaks of brown and green. Behind me, the thing moved through the woods with terrifying speed, its footsteps heavy but somehow silent at times. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like forever, I reached the trail, or what I thought was the trail. Except the trees looked different, the ground unfamiliar. I had no sense of direction anymore. Every path twisted into another, looping endlessly. I stumbled, fell, scrambled back up. The whisper returned, only inches behind me. I saw your face. I screamed and ran until my lungs burned, until I burst through thick brush and tumbled onto gravel, the gravel road where I'd parked. My car was the only thing in sight. I dove inside, hands shaking so violently I dropped the keys twice before getting them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I saw something emerge from the tree line. Tall, thin, wrong. Its limbs bent backward like a spider, its head hung at an angle impossible for any human neck. And its face was my own. Twisted, stretched, smiling far too wide. It stepped toward the road as I slammed my foot on the gas. My tires spun and caught, and I tore down the road so fast I nearly lost control on the curves. In the rearview mirror, the thing stood perfectly still, watching, its smile growing wider as I got farther away. When I reached town, I didn't stop driving until I was in my own driveway an hour later. I locked myself inside and didn't leave for 2 days. I tried to report what happened. The sheriff listened patiently but clearly didn't believe me. He said the woods were confusing, easy to get lost in, easy to spook yourself. Maybe I saw a shadow, a bear, a trick of the light. But I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. Last night, as I tried to sleep, I heard scratching on my bedroom window. Soft at first, then harder, then the whisper, "I found you." I haven't slept since, and I don't know how long it will take before it stops scratching or stops pretending to stay outside. Story the end. It started as a long-planned summer trip for 5 college friends from Pennsylvania. They wanted to disconnect from their phones, computers, and the constant noise of the city. Their destination was a remote section of the Allegheny National Forest, far from any marked trails or campgrounds. The allure of untouched wilderness, streams, and old logging paths made it sound perfect for a weekend adventure. They arrived in the late afternoon, sweat clinging to their clothes despite the cool forest air. The site they picked was secluded, a small clearing surrounded by dense pine and oak, a creek bubbling nearby. After pitching tents and gathering firewood, they built a campfire and settled in. The first night was calm. They laughed, roasted marshmallows, and told stories. Yet even then, a faint unease lingered, rustling leaves that didn't match the wind, shadows that didn't belong to trees. Around midnight, Jake, the most daring of the group, suggested a short walk along the creek. Emily and Sam hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them. The forest was pitch dark, their flashlights illuminating only a small patch of undergrowth. Then they heard it, a distant, deliberate snapping of branches, like someone, or something, was following them. Every time they stopped, it stopped. Every time they moved, it echoed behind them. They laughed nervously, pretending it was a bear, but their hearts weren't in it. By 2 a.m., the noises grew closer. Emily woke to the sound of her tent fabric being tugged. Her heart raced as she shined her flashlight toward the entrance. The beam caught nothing but the blackness outside. Sam and Jake were still asleep, oblivious. Then a low, chilling growl rose from the darkness. It was too deliberate to be an animal, almost intelligent. Emily whispered for them to wake up. When the others realized what was happening, they huddled together, listening to the growls circling the tents until sunrise. The next morning, the group decided to hike toward a ridge they had spotted the previous day, hoping the elevation would provide a better view and perhaps lead them back to a known trail. Along the way, they stumbled upon a dilapidated hunting cabin, half collapsed and covered in moss. Its windows were broken, and the smell of rot hung in the air. Curious, they peeked inside. Old, yellowed newspapers littered the floor, one headline reading, "Hiker missing in Allegheny Forest, search continues." They left quickly, feeling uneasy, but as they walked back, fog rolled in, thick and sudden. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. The trail seemed to twist unnaturally. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Then came footprints, large, uneven, and humanoid but not human. Toes long, nails jagged. They weren't alone. Whispers rose in the fog, low and incomprehensible, carried as if from all directions. Panic took hold. They tried retracing their steps, but the forest refused to cooperate. Every clearing looked identical. Every bend in the path mirrored the last. The whispers grew louder, circling, coming closer. Then they saw them, tall, dark shapes moving swiftly through the mist, gliding rather than running. Their eyes caught the occasional reflection of their flashlight, glowing faint red. By evening, exhaustion and terror consumed them. They attempted to camp near the creek, but when they arrived, the scene was horrifying. Their tents had been shredded, supplies stolen, and the ground around them bore deep claw marks. Dark smears on the dirt hinted at something violent, but the source was gone. As night fell, they huddled together, trying to stay awake, knowing sleep could be deadly. Around midnight, the first scream tore through the forest. Sarah had vanished. One moment she was there, the next gone. The remaining four called out, but only the echo of their voices returned. The growls and whispers intensified. Figures emerged from the fog, never touching the ground as they moved, circling, watching. Hours, or maybe minutes, they couldn't tell, passed in pure terror. One by one, the friends began to disappear. Michael, trying to flee, tripped and was seized by a shadow that moved impossibly fast. Jake and Sam barely made it to a logging road at dawn, their clothes torn, faces scratched, and hearts pounding. They reported the events to the forest rangers, but there was no evidence. Sarah, Michael, and Emily were never found. Weeks later, the campsite was revisited, shred tents, claw marks, and a lingering sense of wrongness. Nothing led away from the site, as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Even years later, Jake and Sam live with the memory of that night. When news of hikers disappearing in the Allegheny Forest surfaces, they remember the red eyes in the fog, the whispers circling, and the unnatural gliding shapes. They know the forest doesn't forget, and it waits patiently for the next group foolish enough to venture too deep. The trip meant to be an escape became a nightmare they couldn't forget. The woods are alive, patient, and intelligent, and for those who wander too far from the trail, there is no return. Story the end. The sun had just started sinking below the horizon when Ryan pulled the car into the narrow dirt trail that led deep into Blackwood Forest. He'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Just him and his friends, Anna and Derek, camping far from cell service and the constant noise of the city. The three of them were eager to disconnect, but the deeper they drove, the quieter the world outside seemed to become. By the time they found a clearing big enough for their tents, the sky was painted in deep shades of orange and purple. Ryan parked the car and helped Anna and Derek carry gear to the campsite. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and a gentle wind rustled the treetops. It was serene, almost too serene. They set up the tents and gathered firewood, laughing and joking, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed unusually still, the usual chorus of insects and birds strangely absent. "This place is creepy," Anna said as she stacked firewood. "It's so quiet." "Relax," Derek said, tossing another log onto the pile. "It's just the forest. It's peaceful, that's all." They managed to light a fire as darkness settled over the clearing. Shadows from the trees danced in the firelight, and the friends sat around roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The atmosphere was cozy, but Ryan couldn't stop glancing into the dark forest beyond the firelight. Every so often, he thought he saw movement, a flash of something darting behind the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. Later, as they settled into their tents, the forest grew colder and the wind carried a strange, rustling sound. Ryan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his tent. Then he heard it. A low, deliberate crunch of twigs outside, moving slowly around the campsite. He nudged Derek awake. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Derek shook his head, groggy. "It's probably just an animal." Ryan wasn't convinced. The sound wasn't random like a deer or raccoon. It was methodical, almost human. Minutes later, Anna screamed. The sound ripped through the campsite, primal and terrified. Ryan bolted out of his tent, grabbing a flashlight and a hunting knife. Derek followed, clutching a heavy stick. They shone their flashlights toward Anna's voice and saw her huddled near the fire, pointing toward the tree line. "There's something out there," she cried, trembling. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still, it moved with a quiet grace, almost gliding over the forest floor. Its eyes glowed faintly in the flashlight beams, and its head tilted in a way that made Ryan's stomach drop. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Anna's arm. Derek grabbed his other arm, and they bolted into the woods. Branches whipped their faces. Roots threatened to trip them, but the forest seemed endless. Behind them, the figure followed, silent except for occasional soft snaps of twigs underfoot. They stumbled into a shallow ravine, hearts pounding, lungs burning. The figure stopped at the edge, tilting its head as if studying them. Ryan could see the shape of its face now, gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that reflected pure hunger. Suddenly, the sound of another person screaming pierced the night. It was Derek, but something about it sounded wrong, twisted. The figure lunged, and Derek vanished into the darkness, leaving only a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. Ryan and Anna ran blindly, desperation fueling their every step. The underbrush tore at their clothes, and the forest seemed to shift around them, guiding them deeper into its labyrinth. Eventually, they came across an old, abandoned ranger cabin. Shoving the door open, they slammed it behind them and barricaded it with a broken chair. They could hear it outside, circling the cabin, sniffing, dragging something along the ground. The smell of iron filled the air, pungent and undeniable. The whispers started next, low, guttural, almost human, as if mocking them. "We can't stay here," Ryan said, voice shaking. "It'll break in." Anna shook her head. "We don't even know which way to go. If we leave, it'll catch us." They huddled together, listening as the forest outside seemed to close in, the dragging and whispering never stopping. Hours passed. Finally, as dawn approached, the forest grew silent. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the broken windows of the cabin, illuminating the devastation outside. Branches and leaves were trampled, but there was no sign of Derek or the figure. When they finally made it back to the dirt trail, Ryan and Anna collapsed, shaking and exhausted. They flagged down a passing car and explained as best they could, but the driver just stared, unbelieving. Authorities searched Blackwood Forest later that day. They found no trace of Derek, no footprints, no signs of struggle, only the silence of the trees. Ryan and Anna never spoke about the trip again, but at night, Ryan could still feel the presence of something watching from the shadows of every forest, every patch of trees near his home. And sometimes, when the wind rustles the leaves just right, he swears he can hear a dragging sound behind him, waiting. Story the end. The sun had barely disappeared behind the thick canopy of the Appalachian woods when Ryan, Megan, and Tyler reached their chosen campsite. They had driven hours from their small town in Kentucky to get away from the city noise and spend a weekend immersed in nature. The clearing they found was small, but ideal. Flat ground, surrounded by towering pines, and far enough from the trail that it felt private. They pitched their tent quickly, each of them eager to start the weekend with a fire and a night under the stars. As the fire caught, casting flickering shadows across the ground, they shared a simple dinner of canned beans and hot dogs. Laughter filled the clearing as Ryan recounted an old urban legend about a man who had vanished in these woods decades ago, never to be found. Megan rolled her eyes but smiled. Tyler, ever the skeptic, muttered something about people overreacting to being alone in the forest. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind rustled the leaves above. They crawled into the tent to sleep, but the forest had other plans. Megan was the first to wake, her stomach twisting with unease. Outside the tent, a faint sound stirred her, a soft, dragging noise like something heavy moving over dry leaves. She nudged Ryan awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" he asked groggily. "Outside," she said. "Something's moving." Tyler, now awake, listened for a moment. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Megan wasn't reassured. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate and slow. Her heart rate spiked as she noticed a faint scraping on the ground near the tent's entrance. Ryan finally unzipped the tent flap and shone his flashlight into the night. The beam illuminated nothing but trees. "It's fine," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his hands trembled. They settled back into their sleeping bags, but the scraping continued, circling the tent. It wasn't animal. It was too precise, too heavy. Then came the sound of breathing, low and ragged, just beyond the firelight that had long since died. Tyler got up to investigate, but Megan grabbed his arm. "Don't go," she whispered. Ryan grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the woods, but nothing appeared. Suddenly, a twig snapped loud and sharp just a few feet away. They all froze. Then they saw it, two dimly glowing eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, watching them from the darkness. The shape was humanoid but impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It didn't move quickly, but its deliberate, steady gaze made every hair on their bodies stand on end. "Run," Megan breathed. Tyler shook his head, frozen by fear. Ryan grabbed his backpack and yanked Tyler along. They bolted through the trees, the undergrowth tearing at their clothes, branches slapping their faces. Behind them, the creature followed, making no sound except the cracking of twigs under its impossibly long legs. They ran blindly, trying to retrace the trail they'd hiked earlier. Panic overtook their logic. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a threat. Megan stumbled into a shallow ditch, scraping her knee, but Ryan and Tyler pulled her up. The creature was still behind them, appearing and disappearing between the trees, always keeping a measured distance as if toying with them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, they had no way of telling. Their flashlights flickered, and exhaustion made every step heavier. Finally, they came to a small creek. Ryan suggested following it, hoping it would lead to a road or human presence. They waded through the cold water, shivering, praying for daylight. As dawn broke, the sounds of the woods seemed almost normal again. Birds chirped, and the wind rustled gently. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. From the undergrowth across the creek, the glowing eyes reappeared. The creature didn't move, just watched, and then silently melted back into the forest as if it had never been there. They didn't stop until they reached a ranger station about a mile downstream. The ranger listened with a furrowed brow as they explained what had happened. "You're lucky," he said gravely. "Not many people get out of these woods after dark when things are watching. People call them the shadows, but no one knows exactly what they are. They don't always attack, but they always observe." The three friends never went camping in those woods again. Even years later, whenever they sat around a fire, they could still feel those yellow eyes glowing just beyond the flames, waiting for the next group foolish enough to wander too deep. Story the end. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when we reached the edge of Pine Hollow Forest, a stretch of wilderness notorious among locals for its dense thickets and winding trails. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap, and an eerie quiet hung over the area. It wasn't completely silent. Birds called in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small animals broke through. But something about the forest felt different, heavier, like the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. My friends and I, five of us in total, me, Alex, Jordan, Mia, and Tyler, were college students looking for an adventure before winter break swallowed the months whole. We'd planned this trip for weeks, loading up my rusty Jeep with tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, and a couple of lanterns. The parking area was small, cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through, and the official-looking sign warned of unpredictable terrain and wild animals. Typical stuff, we thought. Excitement and bravado fueled us as we lugged our gear to a clearing deep enough into the forest to feel isolated but still accessible. By the time we had our tents pitched, the sun had vanished completely, leaving behind only the fading afterglow. Shadows stretched unnaturally, casting strange shapes among the trunks. We built a fire and tried to shake off the discomfort creeping into the back of our minds. Around the fire, the usual jokes and laughter didn't feel natural, almost as if the forest itself was listening, waiting for us to slip up. "Do you guys hear that?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was usually the most confident of us all, but her hand had found mine instinctively. "What?" "I don't hear anything," Tyler said, though even he sounded unsure. "It's like scratching coming from over there." She pointed toward the trees just beyond the clearing. We strained our ears. At first, it was faint, just enough to be believable as branches rubbing together. But then it became sharper, deliberate, scrapes that seemed too coordinated to be random. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the source. Nothing, only shadows that flickered with the firelight. We laughed it off, blaming it on raccoons or deer, but no one was entirely convinced. Night deepened, and our fire dwindled. One by one, we retreated to our tents, trying to sleep. The wind picked up and carried with it a strange sound, a low, intermittent thumping, almost like footsteps but irregular. Every time we paused, it would stop, leaving a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Around 2 a.m., the thumping grew closer, and suddenly a sharp crack echoed from the trees beyond the clearing. Tyler bolted from his tent, flashlight swinging wildly. We all scrambled to see. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no eyes reflecting in the darkness. But the smell hit us first. Iron, like blood, pungent and close. My stomach twisted. I wanted to convince myself it was a raccoon, a deer, maybe a bear, but the scent lingered longer than it should have. And then we heard it. Low, guttural breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from all directions. We huddled together, flashlight beams cutting through the black, catching only more shadows. "What is that?" Alex whispered, his hands shaking as he gripped his knees. "I don't know. I don't think it's an animal," Mia said. Her voice cracked. She was right. Whatever it was, the breathing didn't belong to anything natural. The next morning, tension hadn't eased. We didn't sleep. Instead, we packed quickly, eager to leave. That's when we noticed something. Deep, heavy footprints circling our campsite. Not animal prints. Too large, too human-like, but elongated, almost deformed. They were fresh, embedded in the soft earth near the fire pit. And there were more, circling the clearing, leading into the forest and then stopping abruptly. No one said a word. We knew we had to leave. But as we tried to follow the trail back to the parking area, we quickly realized something terrifying. The forest seemed to have changed overnight. Trails that we had walked easily yesterday were blocked by fallen trees. Paths that should have led to familiar landmarks twisted into unfamiliar groves. It was as if the woods themselves had shifted to trap us. By midday, frustration turned to panic. Our phones had no signal, and the compass seemed to spin without direction. Anxiety thickened the air. Every snapping twig or rustle made us flinch, convinced someone or something was following. We called out, shouted, even ran, but no response came except for echoes of our own voices, distorted and delayed. Hours passed. Hunger and fear gnawed at us. Then we found it. A tree with scratches etched deep into its bark. Not claw marks, scratches like they were made by fingernails, desperate, angry human. And below in the dirt, words were carved. Leave. My heart raced so violently it was hard to breathe. Who or what was telling us to leave? And more importantly, why hadn't we seen them? As night fell again, desperation set in. We decided to climb a hill, hoping for some vantage point to see where we were. From the top, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and unwelcoming. And then I saw it, a figure, or maybe several, standing among the trees. They weren't moving like humans. Their posture was wrong, limbs bent, unnatural, and yet they were unmistakably watching us. And then they started walking toward us. not running, just walking slowly, inexorably. Each step matched the thumping we'd heard the first night. We tried to retreat, but the slope was treacherous. Jordan tripped and fell, twisting his ankle. By the time we helped him up, the figures were closer. That's when Tyler screamed. One of them emerged from the shadows. A man? Not a man? Hard to tell. He, or it, was tall, gaunt, clothes tattered, face obscured. And in the pale light, we saw the most horrifying thing: multiple sets of eyes. Human eyes staring from the torso, from the neck, flickering like firelight, all fixed on us. We ran. Adrenaline fueled us as we stumbled blindly through the undergrowth. Behind us, the forest erupted with movement, low growls and laughter that didn't belong to any animal. At one point, I looked back and saw the figures vanish, melting into the trees, leaving us with only the echo of their breathing. Hours, or maybe minutes later, we stumbled onto a creek. Exhausted and desperate, we followed it, hoping it would lead us out. It did, finally, to a dirt road that led back to civilization. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station 20 minutes away, shaking and pale. We called the police, but they found nothing when they checked the area. No footprints, no signs of our strange visitors, nothing beyond the creek and the twisted trails. We never spoke much about Pine Hollow afterward. At first, we tried to rationalize it: dehydration, stress, hypothermia at night. But I couldn't shake the memory of the eyes, the scratches, and the carved warning. And months later, when I tried to show friends the campsite on a map, Pine Hollow had no official trails beyond the edge of the forest. It was like it never existed. I still hear scratching sometimes at night, always far away, just at the edge of hearing, and I can't shake the thought that whatever watches the woods doesn't like strangers. And maybe, just maybe, it follows those who have seen too much. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike. And I certainly don't talk about Pine Hollow, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those eyes staring back at me through the trees. Story the end. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains as Ryan, Claire, Marcus, and Jenna drove down the winding dirt road into the heart of the White Mountains. They had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a weekend away from their stressful jobs, away from the city lights, away from everything. Their plan was simple: camp by the river, hike during the day, and tell ghost stories around the fire at night. They found a secluded spot near a bend in the river, a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The water ran clear and fast, glinting in the last light of day. Ryan jumped out of the truck, eager to set up camp. "This is perfect," he said. Claire smiled, pulling out the cooler with drinks. "Yeah, perfect, peaceful," she said, though a shiver ran down her spine. They spent the evening setting up tents, collecting firewood, and preparing dinner over the small campfire. As darkness fell, the forest around them seemed to grow taller, the shadows deeper. At first, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft rush of the river. But as the night wore on, they began to hear something else. Faint at first, like footsteps crunching leaves far in the distance. Marcus laughed nervously. Probably just a raccoon or something. But the sound didn't fade. It moved closer, deliberate, slow. Jenna hugged herself tightly. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Maybe we should go inside the tents?" They tried to ignore it, but sleep was elusive. Around 2 a.m., Ryan woke to the sensation of being watched. Sitting up, he shined his flashlight toward the tree line and froze. A tall, shadowy figure stood between the trees, unnaturally still. Its limbs were long, thin, and bent in ways that didn't look human. The faint glow of its eyes reflected in the flashlight beam. "Guys," he muttered, shaking Claire awake. She followed his gaze and gasped. Marcus and Jenna stirred as well. The figure didn't move, but a low, guttural growl emanated from the darkness, vibrating through the air. It was close enough that the hairs on their necks stood on end. Panicked, they grabbed what they could: flashlights, backpacks, anything, and ran into the woods. The trees, normally familiar on their maps, seemed twisted and unrecognizable. Every turn led them deeper, farther from the river and their truck. The growl followed, echoing through the forest. They could hear it moving between the trees, dragging something unseen along the forest floor. Hours passed. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into a small clearing illuminated by the moon. Here the ground was scorched, as if a fire had burned recently. Around it, strange symbols were etched into the bark of nearby trees, jagged and chaotic. They could feel eyes on them from every direction. Marcus whispered, We shouldn't have come this far. We should have stayed on the trail. Suddenly, the shadow moved. It lunged from the tree line with unnatural speed. Jenna screamed as it seemed to glide over the forest floor. They scattered in every direction, branches whipping their faces, roots snagging their feet. Ryan tripped and fell hard, scraping his hands. When he looked up, he saw Marcus being pulled into the darkness, his screams cut off suddenly. Ryan grabbed Claire's hand, and together they ran blindly, heart pounding, lungs burning. The figure followed, moving silently now, waiting for the perfect moment. They reached a steep ravine, slick with moss and wet leaves. Cornered, they had no choice but to climb a fallen tree spanning the gap. Below, the shadows seemed alive, shifting, waiting. The figure appeared at the edge, tall and impossibly thin, its glowing eyes locked on them. It didn't leap, it didn't attack, it just lingered, observing, before retreating slowly into the darkness. They waited until dawn, frozen with fear, watching the forest slowly come back to life. The trees seemed normal again, birds chirping, sunlight breaking through the canopy, but the scorched clearing and carved symbols remained, silent witnesses to the night's terror. When they finally found the trail back to their truck, the relief was overwhelming, though a lingering dread remained. Marcus never returned. Ryan, Claire, and Jenna tried to warn others, but no one believed them. The forest seemed indifferent to their terror. Even months later, Ryan would wake at night, heart racing, imagining the long, thin figure watching from the shadows. Claire moved across the country, trying to forget, but she couldn't erase the image of glowing eyes in the dark. Jenna never camped again, leaving the mountains behind. The forest had claimed a part of them that night, a fear that would never fade, a memory that would haunt every quiet moment. And the figure, patient and silent, remained in the shadows, waiting for the next group to wander too far, too deep. Story the end.